Shanahan. All right. Good morning, everyone. It is great to have you back here, and it's great to be back. Let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, there were more than 38,534 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday, with just under, call it 780 new deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 35,496 cases per day. That's a decrease of 31% from the average 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks earlier, 36% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 47% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,880,000 people total across the United States and killed about 584,000 people. The CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said yesterday that those who had been fully vaccinated no longer need to wear masks in most cases, with the exceptions of traveling by plane, train, or bus, and barring certain highly packed settings like hospitals, prisons, and homeless shelters. People are now free to mill about freely indoors without masks. In national news, Colonial Pipeline, the pipeline company with the downed pipeline over the course of this week, paid a ransom, reportedly, of approximately $5 million to hackers in the Eastern European cyber gang believed to be responsible for the breach of the pipeline's computer system. The group, known as DarkSide, has been said by a variety of Western media outlets to be thought to operate out of Russia, although the Russian government has denied any involvement, and there is notable uncertainty about where the group is thought to be located in Eastern Europe. Governor Ron DeSantis said he would pardon any Floridian, quote-unquote, who had violated a mask or social distancing mandate introduced over the course of the pandemic in his state. In international news, Israel has continued striking Gaza from land, sea, and air, with the known Palestinian death toll rising to 119 over the last few days. 9 Israelis have died so far during the conflict, total that we know of. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the ongoing siege of Gaza will, quote, continue as long as it takes, end quote. This comes as Israel has seen more civil unrest domestically, with Arab and Jewish Israelis fighting, and some rumors circulating that the Israeli police forces are allowing Jewish Israeli gangs to target Arabs living in Israel. The police have denied this, instead blaming Arabs for most of the problems. Lebanon is losing about a quarter of its power supply after a Turkish company that supplies power from shipborne generators decided to cut service because Lebanon is in payment arrears. And Ireland's health service has shut down its computer system after that system was the victim of a severe ransomware attack that has affected both local computer systems and those for the health services of the country as a whole. Vaccines are still being given, although many routine visits and non-severe cases are being delayed as the staff switches back to paper records. And with that, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And I want to come back. There are a couple of these that are actually related, in my opinion, and they have to do with a conversation that we've been having quite a bit recently. We started having, I believe, last year, actually, with Jamarl. When you and I first started on the show, we were kind of recovering from Donald Trump was showing signs, I believe, of pulling out of a lot of the intensity of the trade war with China. I remember this was after the trade war had reached its peak and Donald Trump had sort of started to swing in the other direction. This was mid-2020. Maybe I'm missing something. And it was right, of course, during this time that the pandemic was hitting trade really hard, specifically from Southeast Asia. You had a lot of these East Asian and Southeast Asian countries that were shutting down exports and imports and everything. So you had a couple of crises. You had the Trump trade war hitting. You had the coronavirus hitting. Then within the last couple of months, you've had the Suez Canal getting blocked. You've had the Colonial Pipeline. And now I'll give you two more just that I've just read from headlines. Ireland's health service getting shut down with another ransomware attack this week. And Lebanon losing a quarter of its power supply because an outside company, this one based in Turkey, Lebanon can't pay for it. And so it's just going to lose it just like that. And so there's something about having infrastructure that your people depend on, whether it's, literal physical infrastructure like pipelines delivering natural gas and heating oil, or whether you're talking slightly more metaphorical infrastructure like the computer systems that your country's health services run on, those kinds of things, suddenly being hijacked by outside forces, suddenly being susceptible to them. It's I don't know what lesson there is to learn, but this kind of story should get a lot more attention and focus and a kind of how do we solve this attitude than I see it getting covered.
Yeah.
But like the connection between all of these critical pieces, again, of your energy infrastructure, whether it's the case of the Colonial Pipeline or Lebanon losing a quarter of their freaking power supply to an outside company that decides they can't afford to keep providing it to them. You see what I'm saying with this? These are all connected in a way.
Yeah.
And we should treat them as such.
Yes, we should. I mean, it's a vital service. I mean, that gets to this whole thing of whether or not we want vital services. Like, whose hands do you want those in? Whose hands do you believe that those would be best suited to be in? I mean, it's one of those things where if it's something that, because energy is not necessarily just a conversation about energy. It's a conversation about food supply. It's a conversation about heating. It's a conversation about transportation, the ability to get from point A to point B. And who controls that? Why do that group controls it? And within the context of that control, who has let's say a higher interest or more vital interest in maintaining the stability of those systems? Because at the point where we get more and more technological as a society, we become more and more fragile on some level, if that makes sense. Like, it's like we depend upon energy production. Great. If the light grid goes out, let's say there's an EMP attack, or let's say there's a mistake. Let's say there's an earthquake or solar flare, and you knock out the energy grid. Well, what happens? What happens to that group, to that society? Is the energy grid sufficiently strong from, let's say, a solar attack or from glitches that may take place? I don't know if those redundancies are built in, because redundancy typically means extra expense, if that makes sense. And look, this was a conversation we got to yesterday where we were talking about how cash is this clarifying agent that everybody, for the most part, can get on the same page, and everybody gets on his gut level. It's like, that cup cost about, you know what I mean? It's like, or that land cost about, or I can sell this for everything. It's like, even when we're talking about, okay, what's next? It's difficult to see something that's next beyond that, just because we're so ingrained in regards to what something costs and the expense of those various things. And so it's kind of, but that clarifying agent also means that when somebody has to do something or to build something, expense becomes one of the primary drivers of how it's built. And fact of the matter is, the expense may be cheaper in the long run. Like when I get the cell phone, and they plan for the cell phone to go obsolete within a year and forces me to get another phone. Think of all the components that are in this phone that all of a sudden just get trashed into a landfill. What if our systems were more redundant, were built with this notion of sustainability and for lasting for periods of time, and where despite the additional expense that it may cost to, let's say, build a power system underground, you do it because it stays up longer, as opposed to a power system that's just susceptible to the wind and to the snow and hurricanes, etc. Like, I guess the question becomes this notion of building redundancy within the context of systems that are vital to human survivability. And look, it becomes susceptible to attack the moment that we're dependent upon those systems. But the thing is, how do you get away from that? I mean, I suppose the only way you get away from that is if you have a culture that is not intentionally trying to destroy other elements of a culture. And, that's a whole separate question.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you have areas of let's take one society, let's take our society, and you have elements of that society that become alienated from the larger group. Let's say these guys are oath keepers. Let's say these guys, or let's say BLM, where they feel like we have to say that our lives matter. That's still on some level, a certain degree of alienation with the entirety of the group. And these groups push back against the whole, against what they consider to be the larger, overwhelming aspect of the society that is either left behind or that they feel that is going in somewhat of a wrong direction. And you get this willingness to attack. Like, think of during the Vietnam War. The government is going into the Vietnam War, and you had elements of society that were setting bombs to try to get the government to stop its course. Well, they're setting bombs because they feel like the government, they're alienated from the directions and decisions of the government, and they're trying to get that government to stop. Well, How do you stop people from being alienated from the larger society? I think that's the question. Because even if you say, let's get rid of guns, that's another, of the topics that people have. Let's get rid of guns. We have gun violence. Let's get rid of guns. But is it really the gun in and of itself that's doing it? If the gun wasn't there, would they still be trying to stab people? And if they would still be trying to stab people, you could make an argument, well, yeah, but they can only stab 5 as opposed to with a gun, they can do 50. That's progress. Yes, in a way. But if that individual is still trying to do it, isn't the problem still there? Is it alienation that we're trying to deal with that's ultimately the culprit? Because if you don't have to deal with the alienation, you don't have to worry about putting, okay, we have to put all of this money into security measures to ensure that, because think of how much we spent for the war, to what, $2 trillion in Afghanistan, and Taliban are about to take it? Like, if you didn't have to put all of these over-the-top security measures over and over again, and I'm not even talking about just the basic redundancy that should be built into a system just for good sense standpoint, so you don't have to continuously keep it up and, the need and everything else. I'm talking about just the security measures that needed to be added to those systems to make sure those things don't get knocked down. I mean, when we were talking about the gentleman from the UK that hacked into NASA, he said he put in like password. Now, I know that sounds pretty stupid, but think about if you didn't have to put extravagant measures in amount. Is what we're talking about really alienation at the core of it all? And maybe there's something deeper than alienation, but is it basically you have elements of your world and your society that are alienated from the larger course of that world and that society? And that course, there's going to be some probability of those people that do suicide, that take drugs, and there's going to be some that attack the entirety of the whole. Are we talking about alienation?
So I actually want to come back to that because this is something I've thought about before and I definitely have opinions on, but we're talking about sort of redundant, we're talking about our power grid and different key pieces of infrastructure. And redundancy is one way to make that better. Yeah. So you could do it purely through a sort of, cybersecurity safety approach. You increase the strength of your encryptions. You come up with ways to separate systems from each other. You come up with ways to automatically update and maintain. There are different things you can do in that sort of specific front. Now, that makes your system safer. It makes you more resilient when it comes to these kinds of crises where you're going to get hacked or something like that is going to happen. Redundancy, which you brought up, specifically in something like a power grid, but you can apply it, of course, in many other areas too. Having multiple overlapping ways of solving a problem. That's great too. The problem with that is it's more expensive usually. Yeah. If you think about a power grid, for instance, you could have it be that every house has its own solar panel grid. They, can freely supply to each other, or some of them break down, and then they have a general central power grid that they're all referring it to. And that is pretty cool in its own way. That idea that you have, a sort of patchwork system of like redundant overproduction, surpluses of production of this resource. Yes. That people can freely share when they have more than enough, which the assumption is would be pretty often. Yeah. Of course, the problem with that is that what's cheaper is to create a central power grid, some sort of central solar panel in the middle of whichever desert, even one that you've created by the process of putting the solar panels up there.
But is it cheap?
But that's the thing. I think technically from a sort of logic of efficiency perspective, over certain timescales it is. Over timescales where you don't run into those kind of weird black swan occurrences where the whole thing comes crashing down. Yeah. And which you can't really account for in the way that singularities tend to screw up our math around certain things, literally in astrophysics. In that same way, you don't know what's going to happen on the other side of it. And so pending that point, it's going to be cheaper. But once you get past that point, you have no idea what the cost is going to be if you would have done the redundant system. Yeah. And then the redundant system can break down in its own way, although it seems a bit more...
it's redundant.
Yeah, it's redundant. It's a bit more secure. It keeps you going a little bit longer. Right. So there's that upside to it. But I think part of what this comes down to, why would we prefer a certain time scale? Why is it that we run on shorter loops than we could be? In other words, we could be thinking 30, 50, 100-year time scales. We're thinking maybe 5 years or 10s. What would cause that kind of thing? I'm going to propose one possibility,
go for it.
And then wrap, which is the ownership versus the idea of renting it. If you have, and there's certain ways this could be taken badly or certain ways it could be taken better or whatever. If you own a property, you're broadly less likely to try to screw it up if you really own it, if you're stuck with it, if it's part of your net value or whatever, your net worth over not just your life, but the lives of your family and your grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. If you have a sense of the constancy of that and the durability and the permanency of that, then it seems to me you're a bit less if that is your home, you're a bit less likely to want to screw it or pollute it or whatever. You're a bit less likely to mess it up in various ways. If you're renting it, if you have a sort of more mercenarial stake in it, what it actually matter? You know, if you pollute it or if you destroy it, if you can sell your stake in it and buy a stake in a higher value property and extract the resources out of it, that sort of is the blind spot in the growth motive that causes you to focus on the wrong time scale. Instead of thinking about, okay, how can I make this a system with longevity, something beautiful and ecological? You can think of different ways to look at it. You tend to think about what you can extract out of it while you have possession of it for the period of that possession. How do we solve that? I don't know, but I want to come back to the alienation point that you were making, Jamarl. For me, alienation, when it's done right, is just a kind of variance, a natural variance in a society. Like there's this term from Emil Durkheim, the sociologist, anomie, which is a sort of moral independence from society, viewing society being out of touch with the morals of society. And it can breed all kinds of alienated people, some sociopathic people, antisocial people, but the assumption is it can also breed useful criticism of the negative components of that society. Now, if you have a quote-unquote perfect society, do you need an alienated class or an alienated group or just the alienated in general? I have no idea, but maybe the closest thing we can get to a perfect society right now necessarily involves that undercurrent, because you want the people to be critical of it. You know, as long as there are imperfections, you want the space for people to be able to try to fix those imperfections. Anyway, I feel as though I've gotten my full-throated response in to what you were saying here. We're going to come back, going into a break right now, coming back on our soapbox segment with Jamarl's monologue and our back and forth on that. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I sat with many horrified at what was taking place in Israel or in Palestine areas, the occupied territories. I watched as airplanes, military instruments, fly into an open air ghetto for all intents and purposes, a regional area, and knock down apartment complexes, one after the next. I saw tanks and military equipment basically go into towns and cities. 100 or over 100 Palestinians have been killed at this point, about a third of which are children. And if this is indeed going entirely after the notion of Hamas, why are a third kids? Why are all of these children dying? And part of the reason is because the attacks that are taking place in these small neighborhoods, these small, already grotesquely impoverished neighborhoods where water barely works, where electricity barely works, where more and more of the land has been taken. These are basically reservations. These are basically open air ghettos of an apartheid state. And that is what is being attacked. I don't doubt that rockets are being fired into Israel. I don't doubt that that is not necessarily a good situation to take place. But it is always weird to me that they count the exact number of rockets that are fired. I know of no other conflict, no other contest between people who are fighting where they say, all right, the United States fired 50 rockets, and now we're up to 70 rockets. Who does that? They do that on some level because the attacks are not coming from peers. They do that on some level because, A, it shows, they want to get this terror element across. But the reality of it is, one side has nuclear weapons, one side has tanks, one side gets billions of dollars in weapon and money and armaments from the United States. And one side basically has a media arm that whatever it does, however it does it, not only does it get covered from the United States, but basically media turns a blind eye. It's utterly and entirely astonishing. And the same thing is taking place right now. What's primary here? What's primary? Meaning, what's the thing that started this? What's the incipient thing? And truth of the matter is, all of this has to do with a forced deportation. Meaning something that the world looks at as being illegal anyway, something that even we supposedly in the United States looks at with illegality. This notion that you're knocking people off lands, you're taking and expropriating more and more land, and that is the primary component. That is the part that gets missed. Words that are never really uttered are Palestinian self-defense. Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense? Do they have a right, and I'm going to sound like a good capitalist here, to defend their property? Meaning if you are in a neighborhood and somebody is trying to steal your property, trying to ethnically cleanse that area and have done so in a systemic fashion over the course of decades, and it just so happens to crystallize around one particular area where they say, no mas, no more. Do they have a right to self-defense? Where does Israelis' right to self-defense come from? I mean, you could make a case that says nobody have rights to anything, and that any rights that people have, those things are for the most part God-given. And really, it's not God-given, it's us that are basically giving ourselves this notion of a right to self-defense. And typically, that right is given to each and every one of us, almost in the fair game sense. But not with Palestinians. Those words are never uttered. Palestinian self-defense, those words are never uttered. And when asked about that stuff, people in the U.S. get dodgy. Reporters get very dodgy. Politicians get very dodgy. It's as if Palestinians aren't human beings that are endowed with the ability to defend themselves and to defend their properties. No, that's too much like right. When Antony Blinken was asked about what was taking place here, he gives these speeches every so often. He gives these blurbs every so often. Let's hear Blinken. Let's hear the take that Blinken is giving here. Let's play the clip.
We are deeply engaged across the board, the State Department, the White House, senior officials, with the Israelis, with Palestinians, with other countries and partners in the region, to call for and push for de-escalation. To be very clear, again, we strongly condemn the rocket attacks coming out of Gaza that are targeting innocent Israeli civilians. And Israel has a right to defend itself. Palestinians have a right to live in safety and security.
Let's stop right there.
And
Israel,
the most important thing going forward now is to take down the violence, to de-escalate. And that's exactly what we're working toward.
Let's stop right here. Israel has a right to defend itself. Palestine has a right to live in safety. Notice the difference in those two things. Oh, we must stop the rocket attacks. Okay, what about the indiscriminate violence that's taking place against the Palestinians themselves over the course of God knows how long? That is less important. Let's play the clip of Joe Biden, because Joe Biden, when basically asked about this issue, basically said, tap the mic, Palestinians can drop dead. Let's play the clip.
Are you concerned about the violence in the Middle East, and can you talk about what conversations you have had with officials there?
My national security staff and defense staff has been in constant contact with their counterparts in the Middle East, not just with the Israelis, but also with everyone from the Egyptians to the Saudis to the Emiratis, et cetera. And I had a conversation with Bibi Netanyahu not too long ago. I'll be putting out a statement very shortly on that. My expectation and hope is that this will be closing down sooner than later. But Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory. But I had a conversation for a while with the Prime Minister of Israel, and I think that my hope is that we'll see this coming to conclusion sooner than later. Thank you.
Shane. Shane, you know, the wildest part of this is the question is never asked, do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? That never comes up. Meaning the reasoning that those rockets started to fire is irrelevant to the process. It's always irrelevant to the process. What is relevant is, can Israel defend itself? And it's like, but are they really defending themselves is the question. And in this very specific instance, there might be instances where something might be caused by something else, you know, somebody gets killed and everything else. In this very specific instance, this is land being expropriated and a defense to that. The rockets are not primary. What are your thoughts, Shane?
I'm trying to think about the kinds of conversations you can have about this, because on the one hand, you can look at it from the context of what is moral, what is the right thing to happen in the situation, yeah. Who are negative players, what problems, you know, morally do they clearly have, and I think you could have that conversation for a while, and there's plenty of conversation to have in it. But on the net, I would say the Palestinians have a slight upper hand here, arguably not so slight. They're the ones being occupied after all, in a sort of primary sense. That's what. You know, that's the first thing you look at. What harm is currently being done by which parties, and how do you get that to stop? And then you can sort of take a step back and try to reconcile, come up with some compromise, come up with some agreement. But while there is active harm being done, that's the first thing. That's the moral angle. When it comes to the Realpolitik angle or whatever, the political angle, and you step away from morality, then there are a couple other conversations you can have. One of those is if might is not supposed to simply make right. If there's supposed to be a guiding or binding principle of justice behind our political affairs that we can refer back to make better and worse decisions, of all the countries around the world making arguments like that, it seems like the United States is the one that has prided itself for the longest continuous period of time on doing that consistently. For nearly 70 years, over 70 years at this point, we've been, in our opinion, in a state of ideological supremacy. We have been the ones making the argument consistently that right should make might, you know, arguing the kind of inverse, that what should steer the vessels of war and power around the world are humane, well-behaved democracies, and that anything that goes outside the bounds of, you know, what is seen as acceptable in human rights, any country that abuses human rights is supposed to be our enemy. And what happens, you know, another interesting conversation to have is what happens to that right makes might pseudo democracy when it starts making a lot of might makes right decisions, when it starts going along with human rights abuses wherever they occur, when it's happening with their allies. And I don't know that. That's another that's another conversation that we have. I don't think it's good for it. I think that it, you know, seriously hinders its ability to keep making the moral arguments, to keep using that. It probably harms the cultural sense at home. You were talking earlier about outsiders and alienation. I brought up anime. It probably makes people at home feel a little bit more cognitively disoriented, some cognitive dissonance when it comes to, okay, so, but wait, how am I supposed to behave? What is our country actually? What am I living in? What am I a part of in some sense? You know, if politics is this larger sort of capsule for our motivations as a human species, what do we want to do together? If you're living in a society that continuously lies to itself about itself and does terrible things that if you were to look at them plainly, you wouldn't like, well, what does that do for your sense of what it means to be a human being? Anyway, that's another conversation. It seems like that would have a serious deleterious effect on that civilization. I'm talking about the United States. And then there's the other practical concern, which is what comes next. And that's probably the question I have the least of an idea about. I don't know how you get out of this. You know what I mean? It doesn't seem like there is any bloodless way to get out of it. And once you enter into that kind of thought process, God forbid most civilians have to. But if you do, when you're having to decide between lives, and not just single lives, but hundreds or thousands of lives and the fates of nations, those are the largest questions you can practically ask yourself meaningfully as a person and still have a sense that you get what each side represents. And from a lot of the commentary I've seen, pretty much everybody looking at this, to me, everybody who thinks they have a clear answer on how to solve this problem is either a sort of fundamentalist in a way and evangelical about their cause, or is just honest and has no clue. I don't know how you do it. Well, because if you're a hardliner pro-Palestinian person and you're just like, well, screw the Israelis, and you're saying kill them, get them out.
They got nuclear weapons.
Not only is that not going to fly politically, but morally, from every angle, I'm like, no, that's not good.
Yeah.
Don't do that. But of course, the same thing applies with the current situation.
Yes.
The current situation is also morally terrible. So what do you do with that mess? I have no idea. Thankfully, we get to talk about it on this program. We have guests coming up throughout our show today. In fact, right this next segment, we're going to be speaking with Yakov Shapiro, Rabbi Yakov Shapiro, about Israel, whether or not it is an ethno-nationalist state, after Representative Ilhan Omar made that claim recently. Also, Israel and Judaism's reputation, how Judaism, the religion, is affected by the actions of the state most closely associated with it, Israel. We're going to be talking with Yakov Shapiro when we come back from this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with our next guest in just a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, or with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So we've been having this larger conversation about Israel and the events that are taking place. Yesterday, it was reported that Israel had sent ground troops in, but that has been countermanded, and apparently they haven't gone into Gaza yet, but they're apparently on the ready. We've seen airstrikes where military airplanes were basically knocking down vehicles, knocking down apartment complexes. And up to this point, over 100 Palestinians have been killed, with, I think, a third of them being kids. I think there were less than about 10 Israelis that have died in this process. Well, we're going to have this question or this conversation over the course of the show about what does this mean? What does this mean from the standpoint of Israel? What does it mean from the standpoint of the politics internally into the country? And I have often considered Israel a fascist state, just in the way that they operate, basically an apartheid nation. But is it so? What is Israel in real terms? To have a conversation about it, we're joined with Yakov Shapiro. Yakov Shapiro is a speaker, author, and a rabbi. You can follow his new work on his new podcast, Committing High Reason. You can buy his book, The Empty Wagon, on Amazon, and you can read more about his work on his website, committinghighreason.com. Yakov, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
How you doing, guys? I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You were one of the first people we thought of when this was taking place. I was greatly bothered by what I was seeing. We give Israel billions of dollars. And from my standpoint, the United States is radically responsible on some level for the events that take place. If Joe Biden or if any of these other presidents decided, we are no longer giving you cash, we're no longer giving you weapons, we are no longer protecting you from the international community, Israel would have to change their tack. They wouldn't have a choice but changing their tack. But we don't do that. What Joe Biden does is come out and says, basically, Palestinians can drop dead, as if there is no primary notion of self-defense in the context of Palestinians, that the self-defense is always given from the standpoint of Israelis. And so right here in this very specific situation, we have Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood being basically East Jerusalem, the families being kicked out, despite the fact that those families go back to like the 1940 something. They allow a right of return for Israelis, whether or not they're born in the region of the occupied regions of Palestine. However, those families that had been there for decades are being forcibly evicted. Now the catch becomes, do those families and do human beings in general in that area have a right to self-defense? And if the answer is yes, those people do have a right to defend themselves and their property, then what does that mean in regards to everything that has taken place up to this point, in regards to the attacks, the buildings, the rocket fire, the attacks on the properties within the context of Gaza? Explain this for us, and please give us a framing in the way that you see it.
Okay, first, I have a question, rhetorical question. Let's assume Biden in America says, we're not going to give Israel another penny unless you do whatever we want, whatever that is. How exactly will that solve the problem? Israel is still Israel. They're strong enough to do whatever they're doing, and they don't really need American money or American support to do what they're doing now. The Palestinians don't have an army. The people in Gaza don't have an army. Israel can make their own laws. In fact, if America doesn't give them support, America will no longer have any leverage. I'm not saying it's good or bad thing, but one way or the other, it's not like if America doesn't give Israel money, Israel's going to be a pauper and they won't be able to do whatever it is that they're doing. They certainly could do this anyway.
Yeah, but even though it's not the money, I mean, it's also the protection from the standpoint of the security resolutions. I mean, it's sanctions.
Okay, who are they protecting them from? They have peace treaties with Egypt and they have peace treaties with Jordan. Saudi Arabia are not their enemies. In fact, they're united against Iran. So who are they going to protect them from? Hezbollah? Okay. Israel doesn't need America to protect them from Hezbollah. Israel needs America for all sorts of things. But it's to solve this particular problem that's going on now, I don't think American support is the issue. I mean, it is true that in terms of policy and in terms of ideology, America should not give their money to anybody that acts in a way that America doesn't like. But it won't be a solution, even in theory, if Biden could do this. Don't forget, just like Israel has their own political agendas, America has their own political agendas too, and people like Biden want votes. And that's really what politicians are about. So there's a whole vicious cycle over here going on.
Rabbi Shapiro, there's stuff we brought you on to talk about, but I want to ask the most plainly obvious question that pretty much anybody who talks about this for more than a minute asks, which is, okay, you just talked about the possibility of a solution. You said that America wouldn't be necessarily the key player in it. We can support that process in some limited way, maybe, but that's at best what we would be doing. If there were a solution, it would come, I believe, largely from the Israeli side. Now, whether that's forced or natural, and when that takes place or how that takes place, that's all completely up in the air, in my opinion. But, begs the question. It leads us to wonder, what would that solution be? What would that actually look like? I want to hear from you, Rabbi Shapiro. What would that solution look like to you?
Okay. First, we have an expression in Hebrew, Shelas Chocham Chatzi Tshuva, that means basically in order to find the right answer, you need to ask the right question. So I don't think the question is just what is the solution. I think the question over here is what exactly is causing the problem. And before you had me on, I heard you mention something about, while I was here listening, something about whether or not Israel's an ethnocentric state. And that's really the problem. It's not even an ethnocentric state in the classic sense. Israel's different than all other countries in the world, because in Israel, all other countries in the world consider themselves the countries of their citizens. America, American citizens. Italy, Italian citizens. Israel does not consider itself the country of their citizens, although citizens have citizen rights. Israel considers itself the nation state of the Jews. In Israel, the Supreme Court ruled there is no such thing as an Israeli nationality. There's only Jewish nationality. Jewish is not a religion in Israel. According to Israeli law, Jewish is a nationality. And they made a law in 2017 called the nation-state law, that as far as national self-determination, only Jews have a right to national self-determination in Israel. Other nationalities, such as Arabs, not religions, has nothing to do with Christian, Muslim. It's Jews and other nationalities. Other nationalities have rights as citizens. They could be members of the Knesset, they could be judges, they could be functioning all over. But in terms of national self-determination, whatever that means, and that's the issue, it's only for Jews. Now, there are two sides to that. Side number one, that everybody looks at. In Israel, that means there are Jews and non-Jews, but the national self-determination privileges are only for the Jews. But two, outside of Israel, Israel considers itself the nation state of all Jews living all over the world. They consider themselves my nation state. Now, those are two sides to the same coin. Is Israel the country of its citizens or the country of the Jews? Now, their claim to be the country of the Jews is bogus. They're not my country. But that's what Israel is designed to be. And it's not just the law. In Israel's Declaration of Independence, they don't have a constitution. Their Declaration of Independence is basically similar to what we would call a constitution. It says, Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. Now, there are many states that have state religions. Like England, there's no separation of church and state, right? There are plenty of countries like that. But it's not a question of a state religion. It's a state nationality, according to Israel. And in fact, worse than that, they've never defined what Jewish means. They've never even defined what a Jewish state is. But recently, Netanyahu, in one of his books, and Avigdor Lieberman on Israel's website, the MFA.il, that's like Israel's website, like America.gov, they said that America is to the Americans and Japan is to the Japanese what Israel is to the Jews. Not Israel is to the Israelis. What Israel is to the Jews, even though that's a fantasy.
Well, but it seems like, Rabbi Shapiro, it seems like there are a couple different ways you can look at this. But the one primary lens that I'll use, for one thing, it's a weird, obscure union of theocracy and ethno-nationalist state, which is not something you'd normally associate if you look at the, historically at the more fascist ethnocentric states, they were pretty hostile to religion in their countries, whether you're talking the Nazis or whatnot. That's one just interesting thing I'm noting. Another one, at least in my opinion, another one is that it seems like they tried to inherit and put into practice a social technology from the 1900s, nationalism as a social technology in the mid-20th century. And I thought that ethno-nationalism was kind of past date at this point. I thought that we were moving into some other way of organizing our nations, at least nominally, because clearly you have nation states. That's what the world is composed of practically right now. And yes, they have some decent overlap with the predominant cultural or ethnic identity of the inhabitants of those nation states. But if I think about America, or even if I think about China, which is one of the more, single ethnic countries in the world, I think about the Han Chinese, for instance, I don't feel as though the Chinese government is in the habit, as far as I can tell, of trying to make it only Han Chinese or predominantly or primarily Han Chinese, that kind of thing. If anything, they seem to have lowered the birth rate of the Han Chinese population to try to get other, for a variety of purposes, but that has had the effect of increasing the size of other ethnic minority groups in the country. I guess the point that I'm making here is it seems like on both counts, the idea that Israel is a theocracy and the idea that it is an ethnically driven state, those both seem past date. How have they managed to work in this strange union? Rabbi Shapiro.
Here's how that works. Okay, it's not a theocracy at all. In fact, they don't have any. They don't believe that there's no God in Israel's Constitution, in Israel's Declaration of Independence. They refused to mention God. The Orthodox Jews wanted them to. They refused. They said that we refuse to put in God's name. Israel is not a theocracy. There is no theocratic laws. There's no forced religion at all. In fact, They tried to eliminate the Orthodox Jewish religion. But the way it worked, the reason why it happened, was something went wrong in Zionism. According to them, they wanted to change the whole goal of Zionism, the ideology of Zionism, not the state of Israel, the ideology of Zionism, which resulted in the state of Israel, which came before the state of Israel. Zionism is an ideology similar to communism, which could exist with or without countries, or fascism or capitalism. It is an ideology. And the ideology says that the Jewish people are a nationality, similar to the Kurds. We're not a religion. We once had a religion, or religion was there temporarily until we were able to form a national peoplehood again. But they believed wrongly. It was a prediction. There was a hope that they had that once they create a state of Israel, Israeli and Jew will be the same thing. The Jews will come to Israel. The Arabs, Ben Gurion said, it was a disagreement between Ben Gurion and Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was more of a fascist, and he said that the only way to get rid of the Arabs is to be stronger than them. Ben Gurion said, and he ended up being the first prime minister, that the Arabs will appreciate living in a Jewish state. And there was even a plan that whoever lives in Israel should be a Jew. They don't even know what a Jew is, because the only definition of a Jew is the religious definition, according to religious law. But Israel didn't want to accept religious law. They even don't understand what a Jew is. They have their own definition, and they have court cases what a Jew is. In other words, they invented an identity called Jew. They wanted this to be Israeli state, Jewish state, synonymous, the same thing. Right. When they asked Ben Gurion, what is a Jew? He said, well, what is an Italian? What is a Norseman? Everybody knows what it is, and we don't need definition.
It sounds like they're starting from the wrong place. I mean, I'll pass it to you, Jamarl, but yeah, go for it.
Well, I was going to say, the thing is, if I was born in the United States and I was, let's say, Italian, I don't automatically have a right to come back to Italy. There's not this, meaning even taking it on its own face, it doesn't entirely even make sense in regards to what they're trying to accomplish. And there's a larger question of what does this mean for the people who were there prior? Meaning, what does this mean for the Palestinians as an end result? I mean, in my mind, this looks like a reservation. It looks like they're basically trying to replicate America and what it did with the Native Americans, where the Native Americans get that much more basically marginalized to the point where they take it all. What is, what's your take on end result? Like, where does this go in the end?
Yeah, it's worse than that, because it's not a question of coming back to Israel. If you're a Jew, and if somebody who came from Italy, it's a question of going back to Italy. That's what you're speaking about. But nobody's going back to Israel. Israel's created in 1948. I never lived in Israel. I have a right to return, even though I'm not returning to any. You can't return to some place where you never were. Right. It's a ideology, a fantasy. Zionism is a religion of sorts. It's a civic religion. It's full of contradictions.
How did the early Zionists try to justify the inevitable human hardship and death and all of this that would be caused by the colonization, effectively, of the Middle East?
There were two opinions. About that. Jabotinsky's opinion was, look, colonization is something that's happened all the time, and he actually compared it to all of the colonizers throughout history. He said, no matter how good you are, how well behaved you are towards the people you're colonizing, they will not accept you. So he wrote an essay called The Iron Wall. If memory serves, it's in Russian. I forgot how you call it in Russian. And he said, no, we're going to have to colonize it. Ben Gurion said, they'll love us when we come. They'll appreciate it. We will raise their standard of living.
Really? Wow.
Yes, that's what he said. He said they'll love it.
You got that wrong.
Ben Gurion was the left-wing Zionist, and Jabotinsky was the right-wing Zionist.
Well, and those both seem like such deep betrayals of Judaism. You would know the ethical tenets of Judaism in terms of its moral philosophy better than I would. The moral components of it as a religion, and you could elaborate on those. But on the one hand, you have somebody, Jabotinsky, who effectively believes, to reuse a phrase we were using earlier, that might makes right. That, through force of arms, it didn't matter effectively. Yeah. Other countries had done it. You had the power to do it. Therefore, it was right to do if it was good for your people, that kind of thing. And then on the other hand, you had somebody who was so willing to dilute what it means to be a Jew religiously that effectively you lost the very thing that you were fighting for in some sense. And both
No,
of them
because
seem like
they
a
were not
betrayal or a
fighting-
denial of what it means to be a Jew. But
Yeah, but
you would know better. Yakov, what's your
yeah,
take?
but you see, yeah, but they weren't fighting for Judaism. They specifically wanted to escape from Judaism. The values of Judaism is exactly what they wanted not to be. Jabotinsky said specifically, he wrote it, you can Google it. He said, we have a right for our criminals just like anybody else does. We do not have to be better than anybody. They did not care. They hated the fact that the Jews were. Jabotinsky said that a Zionist is the opposite of a Jew because a Jew is ugly, sickly, is a coward. Zionists are going to be the opposite. We're going to learn to command. We're going to have strong shoulders, broad shoulders, many shades of color. Ben-Gurion said that Orthodox Judaism, that Judaism doesn't change, is Nazi ideology. We cannot confuse Judaism with the Zionists.
Right.
They created Zionism in order to change the character of the Jewish people from the ones who you're describing to people like Ariel Sharon, to people like Netanyahu. This is precisely what they wanted.
Yakov,
when we say it's a betrayal of Judaism, that's exactly what Zionism was.
Yakov, can we go back? Let's go back for a moment to end result. You got pulled away from discussing what was going to take place from the standpoint of an end result. How does this end?
Right.
I mean, you
So
started
the
off
only
saying
way-
that this was going to be worse than basically the American project and the way that America was looking at the Native Americans. What's your take?
Yeah, because America didn't say specifically, we want to import people who are not Native Americans. They weren't looking for a specific nationality. They wanted a self-determination. They kicked out the Indians, right, the Native Americans. I mean, that's what they did. But they weren't looking specifically to create a specific ethnicity or race or whatever you want to call it. They invented their identity. Whoever came, immigration, that's America, right? Israel's different. Now, the only solution is going to be if Israel gets rid of that idea that it's a Jewish state or the state of the Jews. If it wants to have a national religion like England, that's fine, as long as it doesn't bother anybody. But they don't want a national religion. They need to change their name to Herzlstan, for example. Stop claiming that they're the state of the Jews. They're not the state of the Jews. They're the state of the Israelis. And that's what they need to do. And then become a normal country like Canada, for example, okay, with safety and peace for all their citizens, regardless of what their citizens are. Now, in order for that to happen, we have to stop focusing on the granular details of this war or that war or this decision. We need to understand that the problem is undergirded by a philosophy called Zionism, which is a certain concept of Jewish identity. It's a certain version of Jewish history, a revisionist false version of Jewish history. The problem is the world is not interested in getting involved in who's a Jew, what's Jewish history. And so long as they're not willing to get involved in that, they say, it's not our business, that's an internal Jewish issue. If that's what you think, then you're going to have Zionism, and Zionism is going to continue to have the effect that it has on the world.
Let's say for the moment they don't change course, because it doesn't seem like they're changing course. And it doesn't even seem like there's a left wing in Israel. I mean, it's like even the left wing is a right winger. So it's assuming for the moment they don't change course. How does this end? And then I think that's the catch. I mean, because, you can only expropriate so much more land. You can only take, there's only a certain finite amount of space that you can pack human beings into. I don't think this changes, meaning I don't think they're changing course in regards to an ideology. So where does this go?
Well, it doesn't go anywhere. This stays this way perpetually. I don't think they want more land. They just want a Jewish, whatever they consider Jewish majority, to have a Jewish atmosphere. And
but it doesn't change. Wait, okay, so there was one other aspect of this that I wanted to turn to, and I think it makes sense to turn to it now. Then what does that do to Judaism? If they're never going to change, if this is an irreconcilable problem where they have no intent of changing, that would be your fix, but they're not going to do that. How does that affect Judaism, the religion?
Doesn't. Israel has as much to do with Judaism as Buddhism does or as China does. It doesn't affect Judaism. We have to understand that. Zionism is not Judaism. It does not affect Judaism. In fact, Netanyahu and Yair Lapid, they hate Judaism. Do you know that Netanyahu has a daughter who became an Orthodox Jew, and he's ashamed of her? He has pictures of all his children on his desk, but not her.
But but then here's another question. Do most Jews know or believe that?
Most Jews are not religious at all, so they have nothing to do with Judaism, except maybe bagels and lox.
But where the hell does that leave? That's the thing. Where does that leave Judaism? If you're saying most Jews are not Jews, most Jews do not believe in a Judaic way.
In Judaism, they're not religious, right? Then most Jews are not religious. There's no secret about that. They will tell you most Jews believe themselves to be an ethnicity. There's just a Pew survey.
And then how the hell does that affect the religion? I think you see where I'm going with this. And pardon the use of the word hell here.
It doesn't affect the religion. The religion belongs to those who want to practice it. Those who don't want to practice it and call themselves Jew as a homonym. Jew means somebody that eats bagels and lox, or Jew means somebody that has these whatever values, whatever they want. Look what happened to Christianity. You have Protestants, you have Catholics, you have evangelicals. You have all sorts of people. They are Jews for Jesus. How does that affect Judaism? It doesn't. They want to break off of the religion. In this country, we have freedom of religion or freedom from religion. If somebody wants to call themselves a Christian and not believe in Jesus, how does that affect Christianity? It doesn't. All it does is it means that there are people who would like to use the name Christians and not believe in Jesus, but the religion is not impacted at all. Israel does not impact the Jewish religion in the slightest, no more than China does. It's a supersessionism, that's all. How did Christian supersessionism affect Judaism? Not at all.
Well, here's one thing that makes me curious about, though. If you were to look at it seems to me that there is some basis, even if it's a limited one, not for bringing an ethnic dimension to Judaism, but for bringing like the parental familial inheritance thing, where there's an often tradition that you know very well, through mothers specifically, of families becoming Judaic because they decide to keep this tradition up. If the worldwide community of people whose families would have been religiously Jewish, who would have been actually Jewish, to use your sense of the word, if they're no longer that way, and if it's largely driven by the state of Israel, I guess I'm curious to hear from you, an Orthodox Jew. How does that give you an emotion? Does that give you a sense of sorrow? Do you see it as something you should be impartial about, or something kind of irrelevant because the actual faith isn't affected by it? How do you feel about it, Rabbi Shapiro?
It gives me a tremendous heartache, and also it makes me angry because they literally attacking our religion.
Yeah.
It's an attack on Jewish identity. And these innocent, poor Jewish people that think that by serving in the Israeli army or by giving money to Israel, by waving an Israeli flag, that fulfills Jewish heritage. And it's a scam.
That's what I mean. And I poked around in 3 or 4, we've got to close here. I poked around in 3 or 4 different ways when I was asking you that question. That's, to me, it seems like that's the most fundamental part of how that affects Judaism, is that deep, like, schismatic feeling of being divided and sad and angry about what's happening. That seems like a pretty big impact. Rabbi Shapiro, we are out of time. Thank you for the great and extensive conversation this morning. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And for those listening, that was Rabbi Yakov Shapiro. He is a speaker, author, and rabbi. You can find his work on his new podcast. That's Committing High Reason. You can buy Yakov's books, including The Empty Wagon, on Amazon, and check out more of his work on his website, committinghighreason.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, and we're coming back with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, more than 38,534 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with just under 780 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 35,496 cases per day, a decrease of 31% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 36% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 47% have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,880,674 people across the United States and killed 583,990. The CDC said yesterday that those who have been fully vaccinated no longer need to wear masks in most cases, with the exception of traveling by plane, train, or bus, and barring certain highly packed settings like hospitals, prisons, and homeless shelters. People are now free to mill about indoors without a mask. Colonial Pipeline paid a ransom approximately $5 million to hackers in Eastern European cyber gang believed to be responsible for the breach of the pipeline computer system. The group, known as DarkSide, is thought to operate out of Russia, although the Russian government has denied any involvement, and there is notable uncertainty about where the group is thought to be located in Eastern Europe. Governor Ron DeSantis said he would pardon, quote, any Floridian, unquote, who had violated a mask or social distancing mandate introduced over the course of the pandemic in his state. Israel has been striking Gaza from land, sea, and air, with the known Palestinian death toll rising to 119. 9 Israelis have died during the conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the ongoing siege of Gaza will continue as long as it takes. Israel has seen more civil unrest, with Arab and Jewish Israelis fighting, and in some rumors circulating that Israeli police forces are allowing Jewish Israeli gangs to target Arabs living in Israel. The police have denied this, instead blaming Arabs most of the problems. Lebanon is losing a quarter of its power supply after a Turkish company that supplies power from the ship-borne generators decided to cut service because Lebanon is in payment arrears. Ireland's health service has shut down its computer system after it became a victim of a severe ransomware attack that has affected both the local computer systems and those for the health service of the country as a whole. Vaccines are still being given, though, although most routine visits and non-severe cases are being delayed as the staff switches back to paper records. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. That's unfortunate. That is greatly unfortunate. I mean, the idea, 1/4 of their power supply just goes up in smoke because a Turkish company says, yeah, okay, we're done. You guys haven't paid us, so we're going to shut your power off. That's amazing. And the civil unrest in Israel. So that's the other part and the other question. What does it mean for Israel? Meaning, it's one thing to have these military strikes and for you to say, okay, we're going to strike the West Bank or we're going to strike Gaza Strip. You could do that on some level. I mean, it's not a military conflict in the sense that you're squaring off with a peer nation. It's not you laying up against another military. It's basically you attacking civilian targets. But what does it look like when there are protests, when there are Israeli civilians that are Israeli Palestinians or Israeli Arabs, and they greatly dislike what is taking place, and they decide to take to the streets in those various areas? How does Israel put that down? And, because you can't just go mowing down people in, let's say, in Tel Aviv. That's not going to fly. Like it's something different as opposed to attacking the West Bank, if that makes sense. Like they're not going to knock down an apartment complex in Tel Aviv. I can't see that taking place. So it's like how you deal with protests on some level are going to be different than how you deal with, let's say riots or protests that are in specific areas of Palestine that you can designate as being terrorists and just knock it down. Like this seems to be different. It just seems to be taking place inside what they would consider to be Israel proper, as opposed to the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. It's very interesting. And the question becomes, what does this mean going forward? And is this just like every other time? Because it does seem like it's weird. In some elements, it seems like every other time. In certain elements, it doesn't.
What do you mean by every other time? Every other time, what happened?
So the last time this took place, I think it was back in 2012, 2014. My date might be off.
I think 2014, yeah.
They killed what? They invaded. They killed what? 2,200, 80% were civilians. I forget the number of people that were kids. We were still giving them weapons at the time that this was taking place. Obama, I think, found out, or something to that effect, that basically the military was still giving them weapons without even going to the administration to get permission for it. But at the end of the day, it's like we backed them doing that. And I feel Yakov basically saying, well, what do you think the U.S. is going to do, even if the U.S. stopped giving support? And I think that's a fair point, him saying, well, they don't need your money at this point. They're developed the country. But the truth of the matter is, for the decades, the United States pretended as if it was a fair arbiter, and is like, okay, we're in negotiations now. Well, these guys are getting nuclear weapons. These guys are getting billions in weapons. These guys are getting the deference of political opinion. And while all of that was happening over those decades, they kept taking more land. So if the issue is not land, like in the sense that Israel is trying to get more land, then why are they continuously taking more land? I mean, the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, for example, that's the thing that's that ended up being the let's say the incipient thing. And so I feel him on this, where he may make the case to say, look, if Israel never got an ounce of more land, Israel will be still intact. It's fair enough. And if the United States didn't give it a dollar more, it would still be intact. Okay, fair enough. But I don't entirely buy the argument. From the standpoint of security resolutions, from the standpoint of sanctions, from the standpoint of the perspective of other governments in relation to Israel, I mean, you know, it's a question on whether or not those countries that were involved in the Abraham Accords would be able to do that if it wasn't for U.S. interests. Because if you remember Sudan, for example, Sudan started getting with Trump and saying, hey, Trump, how can I, be part of this? And Donald Trump says, well, you got to give us money for something or whatever.
9/11 victims.
To buy into this kind of, these arrangements and deals that were taking place. Could that deal get made if the U.S. was not on board for that deal getting made? Because after all, it was Trump that ended up making that deal. Even if it was the people who were in the upper echelon of those countries that were still working in tacit with Israel, even though it wasn't overt. Well, this made it overt. Is it tenable without the U.S. pulling these guys together? I don't know. I don't necessarily think I buy the argument. I mean, at the end of the day, for decades, we were basically covering these guys as they were just knocking down places and taking land. And so, I feel him on this, but this didn't just start yesterday. He knows that. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I don't know. The situation bothers me.
It doesn't go anywhere. I don't see. I don't see. I'll put it like this.
It just seems stuck.
If with the settlement issue specifically, and please cut in if you think if you think that I'm wrong on any of this stuff, because I'm down to be down.
Yeah.
I'm willing to admit that I might be, and I'm down to get into a sort of passionate, open discussion about what exactly is the case here. But is the status quo a static status quo specifically, where Israel doesn't do any new settlements, but does nothing to give previously claimed settlements back to Palestinians or pursue a one-state solution? That is inherently unstable. That's just going to lead to, it's not like that's going to actually remain static.
Right.
It's going to devolve.
Yes.
Israel can go in one of two directions, broadly speaking. They can either settle more land that is currently held by Palestinians. That's one direction.
Yeah.
Or they can, begin the process of making the society radically more egalitarian, and the divided territories policy in some way, and sort of reconcile themselves, go through that long cultural arc of reconciling themselves with Palestinians.
Like a two-state solution.
Or even just a functional one-state solution, something like that. You could. It seems like that would lead in that direction, broadly speaking. But you can't stay where you are. You either need to settle more or settle less, and sort of reverse that process. Now, the problem is, if they settle more, that's going to. How does that lead to a successful, peaceful one-state solution? Either you have a sort of post-apartheid state where the Palestinians living in Israel under the one-state solution are perpetually playing catch-up and going through, deep inequality, economic inequality, the sense of dispossession, and literally the fact of dispossession, of being dispossessed of property, and then a longer, probable conversation about reparations and how you make that right. And you can see that maybe 50 years or 30 years from now, if there's some weird set of events that happens, that actually being the case, where it's like, okay, Palestinians are now part of Israel. There's some legal equality, there those kinds of things, but there are still serious lingering and real resentments and reasons to believe that the inequality is not just economic, and it cannot just be resolved through economic means, but through cultural means. That's a problem we're familiar with in the United States. Yeah, and South Africa, exactly. These apartheid-style states with literally physically segregated groups of people along racial and cultural lines. Anyway, but if or I don't see how they reverse the settlement process, because Israeli politics, as divided as it is right now, the one common ground that we've seen when we've spoken with our guests is that the Israeli people are broadly, they seem to be okay with what's happening. And then some of the people who are responding to that are like, well, does that make them complicit? Yeah. If they're okay with the settlement process, does that mean that Palestinians pushing back against them should see them as enemy combatants or something like that? To which I say no, but I understand why they have this, that whatever degree of
animosity,
uncertainty and animosity that they have about that question, whether they think it's right to treat them as enemy combatants. But no, in my eyes, those are civilians. Those are civilians who've been hoodwinked by their government into thinking this is what's best for them. And ultimately, the party that you need to look at who's in power, that you actually need to cast your blame on, is the one that's in power, the government.
If we were talking about, let's say we were in a time machine and we were looking at the 1890s in America, like the U.S., and we were asking questions about, all right, do the people in this society accept that there's, or let's say in 19-somethings, 1920s or whatever, and we were asked the question of, do the people in this society know that they are treating these people like second-class citizens? Well, yes, they do know. Do they believe that it is right to do so? Well, in their head, that gets more nebulous. And then you get a secondary question is, are they getting something out of doing it? And the answer is yes. There's a certain degree of self-interest built into it. And does that self-interest obfuscate correctness in regards to their own ideals and their own value set? Now, the same thing is true for the U.S., right? Like you were making mention beforehand that it's disorienting to say we believe in freedom, justice, love, and light, and then behave in a different way outside the globe. What does a citizen in the country think when it says, well, wait a minute, we're saying this, but we're behaving this way? Well, something similar is true in this context. If we're looking at our society and we ask the question, do those people know that they are radically mistreating this secondary element in the society? The answer was yes. And it's like, do they know it's wrong? Well, wrong is different. Like, there's an element of self-interest that is so built into them being able to call it a Jewish state, or being able to take that land, or for Palestinians not to have a say-so in that. And I think that self-interest, I think that question needs to be asked in regards to, do they know what they're doing? Like, this is not like my government deciding to do something abroad that I don't know about. They are directly related to what their government is doing. And they tend to be lockstep with what their government is doing. It's not like, okay, I just kind of tacitly disagree with my... That doesn't seem to be the way it is in Israel. They seem to be completely on board with the government in regards to what it's doing. And so it's like, are people as individuals responsible for what their government do? I mean, that's somewhat of an old question in and of itself. I mean, what about us? Are we responsible for what our government does? On some level, yes. On some level, we were born into it. Did we have agency in those type of questions? But the thing with Israel, they are on board for it. And so it's like, if you're living there, you're living in the context of that apartheid system, you will have some feelings with the Israeli government and the Israelis themselves that are on board for it. Now, it's a secondary question about the rockets fire and everything else, and whether or not, if individual Israelis are entirely on board for the pulling of the land, are there any people who are basically innocent in the process. Like innocence, good, bad, those things get messy and get confusing very quickly. I try to go back to the notion of land because property is very straightforward. Everything else gets hazy. You know what I mean? But let's do this. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with continuing coverage. We're going to talk about Erdogan and Israel. Palestinians have a friend, at least in one corner of the world. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share the audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement help makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. An interesting conversation took place between Erdogan and Vladimir Putin, where Erdogan basically says, quote, the international community should give Israel a strong and deterrent lesson over his conduct towards the Palestinians. I thought this was interesting, considering that many of the world's countries, many Muslim countries, have basically abandoned Palestine, and they're, let's say, coming to terms with Israel overtly, not just the leadership of the countries. But Erdogan apparently making this kind of strong statement in support of the Palestinian cause. To have a conversation about what is taking place in regards to, let's say, Turkish politics towards Palestine, we're joined with Yusuf Aram. Yusuf Aram is editor-at-large at TRT World and Turkish foreign policy expert. Aram, Yusuf, what's going on, man? Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So this statement piqued my interest because many of the other leadership in the other countries in some of those other countries basically joined hands and made a deal with Israel to basically normalize relations. How does Turkey, and what are the politics in regards to Erdogan and Palestine? He clearly is still in support.
Well, first thing, Palestine is an issue that is a very hot topic in Turkey. The Turkish parliament just released a joint statement supporting Palestine and asking for its freedom and wanting to see the violence stopped immediately. And when I mean Turkish parliament, all 5 parties represented in Turkish parliament. We're talking about right-wing parties, left-wing parties, Kurdish parties. So you have 100% of Turkish politicians supporting Palestine. So this is not just something simple you can reduce to Erdogan. This is a Turkish government or a Turkish state position on Palestine. Now, what Erdogan's trying to say in his comments with Putin is we have to learn that behavior is a learned experience. And when we look at the international community's stance towards Israel, while there are UN resolutions calling for a 2-state solution, we've never seen any of this implemented. We've never seen the international community truly take a tough stance that has consequences or that extracts a price for Israeli behavior in the future. So when you don't have any type of costs to stop a certain type of behavior, one starts believing they can act with impunity. And I think that's what he's trying to say, that the United Nations needs to have some teeth, and that they need to let Israel know that certain things are unacceptable from an international perspective. So he wants to see the international community a little more active, supporting the implementation of previous resolutions and asking to stop the violence that's going on. At the end of the day, you have two historic tribes, Israel and Palestine. They're both biblical tribes. They both have very deep historical claims to the area, and the area is large enough for coexistence and cohabitation. There's no need for this type of violence. There's very sensible UN resolutions in place calling for a two-state solution, but Israel, since nobody's implementing any type of cost, Israel doesn't see any need to go to the two-state solution. And when you look at the maps of 1947, I believe 1968 and further on, you slowly see the disappearance of Palestine as time is going on. And right now there are Israeli troops on the Gaza border. All it takes is an incursion by those Israeli troops for Gaza to completely disappear very, very quickly. When we look at the military might of Israel, it's unmatched in that area. There's nothing Palestine can do. There's nothing Hamas can do or any of these other groups can do. Israel has a very powerful army as a state. So basically the situation is left to the mercy of Netanyahu and those who are calling the shots in the Israeli government.
And that is I would agree with you in a detached sense, but when it comes down to what Erdogan is saying and what he would potentially be doing here, Yusuf, thank you for joining us. But when Erdogan says that he thinks that Israel should be given a, quote, strong and deterrent lesson, end quote, what actually specifically does that mean? Yeah. What is he talking about there? What would he do?
First thing what he wants to see is he wants to see some Arab and Muslim unity. He's spent the last 4 to 5 days calling basically every single leader in the Muslim world, Malaysia, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and whatnot. So he's tried to get the lines of communications going to have some unity inside the Muslim world. And that's rare because lately the Muslim world's been very disunited, very detached. And many of the people on Arab Street and throughout the Muslim world do look to Erdogan as a leader of the so-called Ummah, the Islamic community of the world.
Wider Islamic community. But real quickly on that, Yusuf, I could see Israel treating that as suborning protest and dissent and all the, part of one of the most serious aspects of this story is not just their invasion and killing of Gazans, Palestinians, but also the ongoing wide civil unrest, not just in Israel, but particularly in Israel and around the world. So if you're suddenly appealing to, unifying the Islamic community, I could see Israel in particular treating that as, again, trying not a color revolution tactic necessarily, but something sitting, next to that. You're trying to get this domestic civil unrest movement going.
This round of escalation is different to previous years. It's different to previous intifadas and whatnot. Now, the Palestinians can call for an intifada, which is basically an uprising of Palestinians. Right. But in recent days, we've also seen the head of the Quds Force, the Iran Revolutionary Guard, also visit Lebanon. We've seen rockets going from Lebanon to Israel. So this kind of shows a possible repeat of 2006, a possible Israeli-Lebanon war could erupt out of this conflict with the Palestinians as well. So Israel could be faced with an intifada, plus a Israel-Lebanon war, plus for the first time adding a different dimension to what has happened. And this is something that we've never really seen is Israeli Arabs rising up as well.
Right there.
So while Israel does seem to be in control of the situation, it is very fluid and it could get very, very fragile very, very quickly. And this is something that should be concerning for Israel national security. And I completely empathize with them as well. There is no right or wrong in this situation. Everyone has very legitimate arguments.
Well, right there. I mean, and that to me is the thing that looked different because it wasn't just, okay, this is Gaza or this is just the West Bank. It was internal. Like it was Israel Arabs or that were rising up, that were in protest. And, the level and the scale of it, it seemed to be very significant as opposed to what it looked like in some of the other times. And it seems to be taking place all at once. And
the timeliness of this, you have Lapid trying to form a government. You have a possible coalition of parties that could have happened without Netanyahu, leaving him on the outside and opening him up to prosecution. Yes. And then all of a sudden you have this breakout. So, I mean, when you look at this at face value and you dig into a little, this does seem like a manufactured situation, and Netanyahu does seem to benefit from this situation.
No,
the problem is when you reheat a conflict like this, when you reheat an issue that is so deep rooted, after a while it gets out of control and out of your hands, and it seems to be spiraling out of control right now. And this is something that I really think many Israelis should be concerned with. What is going on in my country? They should need to be asking that, because there are some serious far-right movements inside Israel, and it's very, very concerning to see this type of mass movement against Arabs, mass movement against Palestinians, and Muslims as well. This is very, very concerning, because Israel is generally a tolerant country, okay, at least on a people level. Yes, the government has been very tough towards Palestinians, but on a people level, it's been tolerant. But we're seeing that tolerance disappear right now, and that is very, very concerning.
On a people's level, Israel is a tolerant. I don't think, I mean, I suppose it depends on who you are. If you're an American, yes. If you're Arab, not so much. I mean, like, let me ask you this. You made the point of saying from the standpoint of the you know, this is dangerous and that they need to pay attention to this. And this might be manufactured. I agree with you that this is great for Netanyahu from a power-based standpoint. It invigorates him. And for the most part, it allows the government and the people in the government to orient around him and everything else. But manufactured, I mean, at the end of the day, they were trying to ethnically cleanse Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. And in doing that, you have people who are pushing back against that. Like, what part of that is manufactured? I mean, for the most part, they were expropriating land anyway.
What's manufactured is the timeliness of these events and sparking this right now as the left is trying to form a coalition. That's what I mean by manufactured, using this event for domestic political gain. At the end of the day, Netanyahu's trying to create the narrative as only I can protect you.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing, and it's the defensive. If your people suddenly feel under threat, if they currently recognize you as their leader and you recognize them as your people, there's something primal about, there's this threat. You see me fighting them. You see us killing more than 10 times as many of them as they're killing of us, and you feel pretty safe about that. And so, support me effectively. I mean, that's a sort of blunt modern way to phrase it. But
this plays out
very
well domestically.
Yes, you know, it does play a bit, but I also I'm skeptical of claims that things are fabricated just because I want to see proof. So when you say fabricated, I hear what you're saying, and there's a potential for it. And so I'm not the kind of person who shuts that thing down just right up front. But I also, you know, anyway, that's not what we brought you on to talk about. Two quick other things here. One, I want to go back to this idea of a color revolution. Turkey, by trying to unify and align Arabs and specifically Arab Muslims, that would include those in Israel. That does sound like foreign interference to me, at least in the soft sense. And I could see, again, not Israel not just responding to it in those terms, but this actually potentially destabilizing Israel if Turkey is successful with it. Any view on that? And what do you think Erdogan's perspective is? And then another broader question, what does Erdogan see Turkey's stake in this region being in general, whether it's relating with Israel, or we could move to Syria, potentially, you know, a contentious side of the conversation, or with Lebanon. What is it in the Levant, in that region? How does it see itself being involved, and how does it see that territory in relation to Turkey's own interests? Yusuf.
Okay, well, first of all, Erdogan has wanted to unify the Muslim world, but this is not just the Palestine issue. We've seen him try to unify the Muslim world for Rohingya, for the Syrian opposition as well.
Talk of a neo-Ottoman empire. That is a phrase we have heard used several times to refer to Erdogan's ambitions.
I find that such a funny phrase, because, look, Turkey is a country that's growing into a regional power. And what does a regional power do? It projects its power into its region, into its neighborhood. And yes, its neighborhood happens to historically be the Ottoman Empire, but
it's also the descendant of the Ottomans.
What do you expect Turkey to do? Project power in Argentina and Australia?
Oh, no, of course. No, and I'm not even using that as a diminishing or a derogatory, because it's possible that Erdogan could pull it off. So I'm not saying that as a sort of way to mock it. But again, it seems to be the historical way that it's what Turkey would aspire to be effectively as the, you know, inheritor geographically of the Ottoman Empire's main territory in, you know, Asia Minor and modern day Turkey, that region, you know, it fits with it. But how do you see Erdogan being involved in the Middle East, in this region?
It's a very problematic and Orientalist view of what's going on in the Middle East. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the West that don't understand what's going on in the region, they like these little type of labels because it makes that information edible and more digestible.
Okay, good to know.
But
Good to know.
at the end of the day, Turkey, just like any regional power, is projecting power into its neighborhood. It doesn't have any type of designs to bring an empire back or anything like that. There is no such talk of anything like that domestically. Turkey wants stability on its borders. That's why it's interested in Syria. It doesn't want to see another 3 million migrants crossing the border into Turkey. That's destabilizing.
With Israel specifically, we can come back to Syria because we've only got this one segment with you. We can come back to Syria at some other point.
Palestine is an ideological issue. Palestine is an ideological issue. This is purely ideological. Turkey does not have any plans to project power onto Israeli territory. It never has. It never has tried to. But Palestine is an ideological issue. Erdogan's base gives huge importance to this. Conservative Muslims give huge importance to this. At the end of the day, the Ottomans were caretakers of Jerusalem. The Jordanians are caretakers of al-Aqsa Mosque. So this is very, very important. You have to realize that when Muslims pray, they always face Mecca. Yeah. But before Mecca, Muslims used to face al-Aqsa Mosque. It was the first Qibla of Islam. So it has this very deep historical significance to every Muslim in the world, al-Aqsa Mosque. So Jerusalem, or Quds as it's said referred to in Arabic, is very, very important for many of these people on an ideological level. And that's one of the reasons why Erdogan's taking a big stance on this issue. But from a foreign policy level, it's actually hurting Turkey. Turkey was in the process of trying to normalize with Israel. And Turkey has much to gain with a normalization with Israel.
But from the religious component, specifically, we got to close, but specifically with the events at al-Aqsa Mosque, Erdogan, seeing himself as somebody who should represent the interest of the Muslim community globally, and feels the need to get involved, that's the claim here, but it's actually hurting Turkey's interesting conversation. Yusuf, we need to come back with you on this at some point, maybe as it develops, and certainly to talk about Syria. That's another, again, potentially a contentious issue, but I believe in us. I believe we can have that conversation. Yusuf Aram, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Those listening, that was Yusuf Aram, editor-at-large at TRT World and Turkish foreign policy expert. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a minute with Jonathan Katab. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We're joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're going to continue the conversation about the let's say the conflict that's taking place in Israel with the various bombings. It's unclear what is exactly going on the ground. Initially, there were reports that Israel had basically moved into the Gaza Strip. We were being told that that is not the case, even though there's been over 100 deaths at this point, with, I believe, there were 10 Israeli deaths. To have a conversation about what is taking place here, because this does feel different in the way that Yusuf mentioned, with the number of Arab Israelis that are basically protesting on the various streets, but also in the pushback and what the pushback is for. To have this conversation, we're joined with Jonathan Katab, Mennonite human rights lawyer in Israel and Palestine. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. One of the questions that I had as I watched this, and I was looking at all of the locations, I think there were like 9 to 12 locations where there were protests taking place. And this is not even dealing with just the Gaza Strip in and of itself. This seems different to me. Is this different? Is this an uprising? And if so, or if not, what does an uprising even look like under these terms? And would Israel even be able to put something like that down if it was too, let's say, expansive in the number of people that came out, or if the protests were so over the top and so overwhelming that they just kept coming? Is this an uprising? or is this something else?
Well, it is different. The major difference, I think, is that people are willing now to look at the entire Palestinian problem rather than limit it to an issue of what to do with the areas captured in 1967, which is the West Bank and Gaza. The totality is that the Palestinian people are one people, that when the State of Israel was created to be a Jewish state, it had to be done by displacing, fragmenting, exiling, basically destroying the Palestinians as a people, splitting them into different portions, some exiled forever, refugees, some caught in Gaza in an open-air prison that Israel can hammer whenever it wants to, totally disproportionately destroy it. Some in Jerusalem who are sort of citizens but not citizens. Some who have the vote in Israel but have no political power whatsoever because their vote means nothing, and their representatives in Knesset are not allowed to participate in any Israeli government. And so they just sit there doing nothing. Because this is a called the Jewish nation states, which says that self-determination is only for Jews in Israel. So initially, the world coming out of the Second World War and the Holocaust felt sympathetic to the idea of a Jewish state. But now I think they see what it means. They realize that to grant rights to Jews that you are denying to non-Jews is illegitimate, is apartheid, is discrimination, is racism. No matter how much one feels with the pain and the sorrow and the evil of anti-Semitism, to favor Jews over non-Jews is not the answer. To create a state that systematically and institutionally discriminates against the original population just because they're Christian or Muslim, that they're not Jewish, is no longer acceptable.
Well, Jonathan, we have heard this. We've spoken with many guests who have said, effectively, this shouldn't be acceptable. We should not accept it. Things need to change. And I hear you saying that as well. But at this specific time, do you see the ball moving forward? Do you see anything fundamental changing here? Is this an uprising that will change something? Or is this just another bitter part of this long, drawn-out oppressive struggle? Jonathan, what do you see?
I think it will change something, because the State of Israel, since its creation, has always depended massively on outside support and sympathy, not just financial, not just military, but also diplomatically, that they were protected from international law, shielded from United Nations, shielded from international intervention. And I think that type of support is now being questioned.
Where do you see that? Who do you see questioning it? If you had, what do you see? Where are you seeing that now? Who are you seeing step away from this now that you weren't seeing previously?
Yeah, because Biden, frankly, and the administration are definitely on board for basically
in
giving these guys a
everybody
pass.
except for the top 1%. Support for Israel used to be an acceptable thing in intellectual circles, in the press, on campuses, in the churches.
But does that operationally change anything?
People who are decent.
But does that operationally change anything in regards to the way they operate? Like, for example, right now, Joe Biden comes out and basically says Israel has the right to defend itself. And the idea of Palestinians' right to defend itself is off the table. Ned Price, same thing. Blinken, same thing. These guys are basically lining up almost ideologically across the board saying whatever Israel is doing in this case is perfectly legit. So even if support is pulled away elsewhere, does it materially change anything in this situation?
Again, you are talking about the top 1%, and the top 1% continues to support Israel. The top leadership, the top echelon, the powerful, the university presidents, boards of trustees continue to oppose Palestinian activism and to oppose BDS. But the population, the movement of history, the general milieu, that has changed and is changing very rapidly. Now, when will it when will it materialize into something concrete? This is how history changes. On South Africa, until the last year or two, the big corporations, the big governments, the big Western powers continued to support that regime. It was only till the very end when it suddenly collapsed. And I think you will see something similar here. Right now, what Israel is losing is not the support of Biden. It's the support of ordinary, decent, Jewish, as well as other people in this country. This is where you see the sea change coming, and coming very rapidly. Among young Jews in this country, they are horrified. They are embarrassed. They don't want to have anything to do with this state that in their name is doing horrible things and war crimes and crimes against humanity.
I would like it if you were true, Jonathan, but I also, and I'm not going to belabor the point because there's only so much. I'm going to have to take your word on this one because I simply don't know. I simply don't. It's not like I have perfect polling data or something like that where I could see it. I'll put it like this. For as long as I have been an American and somewhat politically conscious, there's been this weird environment that doesn't seem much to have changed to me, which is you can criticize Israel, but if you criticize it too much and certainly in certain ways, and you're in the media, the intelligentsia, you're a politician, it's going to kind of get drowned out, and you're going to have weird things lobbed at you about being an anti-Semite. And even if you don't say anything that is anti-Semitic, there's going to be this feeling of, well, it's kind of weird to talk about. But then in the streets, people get into conversations about it. It's still a little bit pitched, and you're a little bit touchy about it, depending on who you're speaking with. But you have conversations about it, and that's what happens. I don't feel like the air quality has shifted or whatever on that. I don't feel like anything in the ambient environment has changed on that. But you could see things that I don't anyway. What would it look like if there were a mass movement in the same way that there were around South Africa, and things suddenly started to crystallize into action? What do you see coming out of that, Jonathan?
I have been tracking it also very carefully, and I know that the conversation has in fact shifted. Things that I could not say 10 or 15 years ago are now taken for granted and accepted. For many years, Israel was considered the only democracy in the Middle East. They could do no wrong. People had a hard time even accepting the proof that Israel was committing human rights violations. The word apartheid was taboo. You couldn't talk about apartheid.
And you would know better than I would. You're not only older, but you've been preaching this stuff. So I will have to give it to you on that one. And that's good to hear. And just quickly, other examples of that. You're talking about apartheid, that word, the idea has been more accepted. What else are you seeing?
I'm saying that Israel has shifted in the public consciousness from being the darling, the light to the nations, the gold standard to be followed, to a country and the victim,
the most moral democracy,
and the poor,
that one,
and the poor, the democratic Western, almost white country, so totally accepted in the United States, I think has shifted to being this very powerful, extremely aggressive, nasty people that you'd better stay away from, you'd better not touch, because they will come after you no matter what you do.
Jonathan, just one more question on this before we have to leave. What is on the other side of this from the standpoint of a state that can incorporate either the both, meaning Palestinian independence in this case? Is it a single state? Is it a two-state solution? Because it doesn't necessarily seem like there's enough land at this point, or even that there's enough, electricity, water, et cetera, to make the two-state solution work. By the same token, Israel looks at any dilution of Israel as being not Israel. So what is on the other side of this conflict? Can you see that? Can you detail that for us in your mind?
I can. And it's not a two-state solution. It is going to be a single state. The question is, will it be an apartheid state, or will it be a democratic state with equality and freedom for both sides? Now that struggle is long and hard. You have to remember it took about a century and a half for African Americans to be even recognized as human beings rather than property. It took 100 years ago, women didn't even have the vote in the United States. So in historic terms, if you take the long view, things are changing. It'll take time. It'll take suffering. It'll take struggle. But the end is very clear. The world is moving towards greater equality, greater recognition of the humanity of everyone, greater rejection of apartheid, war crimes, inequality, and racism. They will continue to exist, but they will no longer be acceptable and they will no longer be unchallenged.
The voice that you guys were listening to is Mennonite human rights lawyer in Israel and Palestine, Jonathan Kutab. You guys are listening to Fault Lines on Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. Lines are now open until the end of this segment in about 12 minutes now. So if you want to call in again, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, I brought this up with you once before. There's this theory of history called the Whig theory of history, the Whig way of looking at history. And this is WHIG, not just WIG. The Whig theory of history would always have hair if it were that way. But the Whig theory of history, the WHIG one, basically says history is getting better. There's a sort of continuous progressive motion upward as we improve our moral faculties, as we improve our technological capabilities, as we improve in these various ways. It's effectively a linear arc that's, bending parabolically towards, something much better all the time. Anyway, I don't buy that, really. But I just want to point it out because I notice it in how a lot of people talk about these things. And it's a natural thing. And I'm genuinely not trying to be pedantic or patronizing in talking about it. The idea that things are getting better does actually explain a lot of what humans have seen over recent, generations, centuries, whatever. The idea that things seem to be improving, that we're like improving our capabilities. And if you think about humanity itself as a kind of single organism that has grown and shifted, and the people are its cells, and it keeps changing over time, then that organism can do a lot more now than 100 years ago, and it could do more 100 years ago than it could 1,000 years ago, and kind of et cetera. Although, of course, this is what leads me at least to disbelieve the Whig theory of history. Although, of course, there have been weird periods of remission where like civilizations have collapsed and we've sort of fallen by the wayside. What we need to do if we make things better is be able to make things better. And if we want to do that consistently, this is almost a tautology, we need to be able to do that over time, over multiple generations. And we need to teach ourselves and remember how we run these things. I get this is a sort of weird general point, but I feel like in a civilization, in a functional society, in a functional political system, you have people who understand how to best do things.
Yeah.
And they fill the essential roles of those societies, and they've taught each other and learned over generations. And you have all these, institutions of government, and whether it's a capitalist society with companies or different kinds of societies historically, when they've worked not just for sort of pure material impersonal factors, but because you've had a personal class of people in these elite positions who managed to teach each other more or less effectively how to do what they'd always done. And they changed it over time. Anyway, I don't mean to belabor the point. My point is, when things fall and we forget who we were and the Whig theory of history fails, which it does from time to time, it's because of individual people failing to do their jobs. And if we're seeing that right now, our political class is one of the key classes that is failing to do their jobs. If you look at our politics, if you look at the people that we've put into office, are they effective administrators, or are they just riding the curve of party popularity getting put into place? And the real administrators are members of this, in some cases, literally hundreds of years old, collection of bureaucracies, different parts of the American state. But the youngest of them are almost always like decades old. Even the new agencies tend to be staffed by older players when they first get created. And so you have this constantly aging system. And if nobody knows how to run it, if nobody knows how to improve it, it declines. That's inevitably what happens. Anyway, 202-521-1320. Didn't realize we had so many callers. Let's get to him. Michael from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Yeah, I wish Jonathan was on the line to talk to me, because I really love to speak to him. Jonathan is so on the money. It is like Israel is an apartheid, racist state. They're committing genocide. Literally, they're committing genocide. At best, it's ethnic cleansing. Yeah. At worst, it is genocide. This is no better than, I've talked about this before, this is no better than the ghettos in Poland where the Jews rebel, which are held up as a symbol of Jewish rebellion against the Nazi occupation and the Nazi extermination of the Jewish people. And the extermination did happen. It did happen. But why should the Palestinians suffer for this? The Palestinians are being persecuted. They are kept in open-air prison camps. It is basically a ghetto. Yeah. And they are being annihilated by the Israeli state. And I fully support every means possible the Palestinians can respond by, whether that be what we call terrorism, which is politically motivated terrorism, but what the Israelis are committing upon the Palestinians is politically motivated terrorism. They are terrorizing the population mentally, physically, historically. They have done nothing but, since the occupation of Palestine, terrorize these people. And these people are rebelling. It's their duty to rebel. It's their moral obligation to rebel against the occupation. And the Israelis are committing genocide against them. In my opinion, the Israelis are fully responsible for every missile, every bomb they launch in the Gaza, and like 10-story buildings with children, with women in them. I mean, and at the end of the day, I really wish Jonathan could speak about this, because no one can speak about this anymore. You can't speak about this.
Well, but he was speaking about it. What he said is that you can speak about it more these days than you could historically. So on that one, he's taken the opposite tact from you, Michael.
Well, I actually think Jonathan's right on that. I don't think he's right that it's materially changed, if that makes sense. Where it's the politicians and the people who are in power who make decisions on that stuff, that they've changed their point of view. But his argument is, well, people are changing, even if they haven't changed their tack. But the catch is, even though people may be changing, you're still stuck in the situation of, but the mechanics of it are still functioning in the way that the mechanics have always functioned.
We got two more callers, but I want to follow up on this real quick. Do you think that it's changed in the 1%? Do you think that in the upper classes, in the politics of the American state, because you see Representative Ilhan Omar is calling Israel an ethno-nationalist state, specifically calling Benjamin Netanyahu an ethno-nationalist. Yes. Not saying that about Israel, but saying that about Netanyahu as prime minister for Israel right now.
And Rashid Tlaib, she has been very strong. I mean, she's Palestinian.
Now, what does that mean? Is there a shift in the space? Is that opening up?
I mean, that's 3 people.
Well,
maybe 4.
Yeah. But those are also some of the better known politicians. I mean, certainly on the progressive wing, but just in general right now, because progressives are kind of influential.
Well, you can make an argument that there's a small cohort now that acknowledges that Palestinians are human beings, and that wasn't there before at all. So, that's what I mean. On some level, you can say, okay, there's at least the contrary argument, and maybe that wasn't there before. And it's what does that mean? And maybe it doesn't necessarily mean anything in the strictest sense of what you can see, but maybe it's kind of like sand sinking out of a particular thing.
Yeah. What's screwed up is that Trump, who was the anti-imperialist type of person, even though he did some bad things, but anti-interventionist, broadly wanted to change our foreign policy. He was buddy-buddy with Israel
Yes, it was.
to the utmost extent. So there was this opening for that kind of pushback. You didn't see it under him. And of course, if you had seen it under him, that would have been derided as white supremacist, white nationalist.
Man.
You can't even, you know it.
Yeah.
And that was,
he's anti-Semitic,
and that
he's
was
racist, he's Nazis.
Yep.
Yeah, it would have been horrible.
That was the sort of token defense that a lot of Trump supporters gave. And it's a valid defense, in my opinion. No, he's not a white nationalist. No, he's not a white supremacist. No, he's not a Nazi. Look at how much he supports Israel. That is a valid defense against that argument, in my opinion. But hey, then there are people who call Israeli fascist too. Anyway, we got Peter calling in from New York. Peter, you're on. What's on your mind?
Hello, how you guys doing?
Good. How are you doing, man?
I have two questions. I'll make them very short. This way, I'm not taking up much of your time. But I appreciate you guys. You guys are good to listen to.
Thank you.
One, Andrew Yang. Everyone in New York City, they're always yelling about, Andrew Yang was is for Israel. And New York City, I would like to see you guys start yelling at Biden now. But you know what? They're not doing it.
Well, they may yell at Biden on this. I mean, Andrew Yang basically was backing up Israel while the missile strikes were killing kids. That was their issue with Yang, that Yang just seemed to be so over the top pro-Israel as they were going about knocking down buildings. Now, whether they go after Biden, look, I don't know. I mean, for all intents and purposes, every last Democratic president, I don't think you could find a Democratic president that wasn't on board for Israel. I mean, I remember when I was traveling, I got into an argument with an Israeli. We were on a train going bungee jumping in Nepal, and it just so happened that my neighbors, the person who was sitting right beside me on the bus, was Israeli. And they heard me have a conversation telling somebody about traveling through certain areas of Palestine and going to Bethlehem. And that perked their ears up. I could see the guy almost on the other side look up and walk over to me. I was like, oh, God. Because I knew where this conversation was going. And he was like, Palestine? Where's Palestine? What do you mean Palestine? Where's that on the map? Where's that on the map? And his point was, well, there is no state of Palestine. And it's like, well, yeah, because you guys are not letting it say. It's like you guys always complaining that, they're trying to get rid of Israel. They're trying to get rid of Israel as they prevent, to say, a Palestine. But we're basically on the thing, and he's initially really defensive for like the first hour. And I'm like, dude, I'm not attacking you. And this wasn't even during the time I was all that political. I was pretty much apolitical. And I was like, look, I can see where you guys will take the crops and destroy those crops. And those people don't have enough to go in. And he would explain it. Well, it's because of this. Well, I could see where you guys do this. Oh, okay. And he would explain it. At the end of that call, he says, in the conversation, okay, I can kind of see why people take that tack with Israel. But his initial thing was defensive because he thought I was going to have a go at him about it. It's a very different, it's a heady experience being over there. We have one more caller. So let's go to
James calling in from New York. James, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I want to kind of tie a thread together what you were saying about the moral arc, about Whig theory. And
the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards fairness. That's where it's going.
Recitation. Yeah, but also, I also, in tying it together, I agree pretty much with the first call from Australia. Yeah, I am so not in conflicted, just so clear about the condemnation of Zionist Israel and the policy against the Palestinians, because I watched and was indoctrinated from a child in elementary school, the whole notion of what the Jewish Holocaust and the suffering of Jews, and it meant so much to me in terms of people searching for their humanity, to find not necessarily all the people of Jewish faith, but Zionists to practice what is essentially clearly genocide against the Palestinians. It's unacceptable. And so I bend towards, or at least I reach for this notion that, the moral arc of history and justice will prevail, that we will find our sentient beings inside and live a better existence for Jamarl, you might relate to this, that those who will come amongst us that identified as on the so-called aliens or what have you, these unidentified spaceships, will say, we'll come in contact with you.
James, I'm sorry, man. You're making a point. I need to go to a break. We're going to close and come back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for another hour, the last hour this week, in fact, of the most disruptive show. The most disruptive of shows, coming to you from across the divided states of America and the increasingly fragmented surface of our globe, covering news, politics, events, and more. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, I'll come back to it. Let's get into the headlines. Hope everybody's morning is going well, continues to go well, and has gone well so far. First up, in COVID news this morning, more than 38,534 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, with just under 780 new deaths. Over the past week, there has been an average of 35,496 cases per day. It is a decrease of 31% from the average 2 weeks earlier, the largest percentage decrease we've seen in weeks now. So that is good. 36% of the American public has been fully vaccinated, and 47% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, to give you total numbers, the coronavirus has infected more than 32,880,674 people across our country and killed about 583,000. Thousand 990 people across the United States. Also here in the U.S., the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, said yesterday that those who have been fully vaccinated no longer need to wear masks in most cases, with the exceptions of traveling by plane, train, or bus, and barring certain highly packed settings like hospitals, prisons, and homeless shelters, people are now free to mill about indoors without masks. In national news, the Colonial Pipeline paid a ransom of approximately $5 million to hackers in the Eastern European cyber gang believed to be responsible for the breach of the pipeline's computer system. This news comes on the tails of the move early yesterday, the day before actually, in which Colonial Pipeline rebooted its pipeline system, the over 5,500 miles of pipeline stretching from Texas up the eastern seaboard, supplying almost 50% of the eastern seaboard's natural gas and energy needs. Anyway, the group that was responsible for the cyber sabotage, the ransomware attack, known as DarkSide, has been said to be thought by FBI officials and others to operate out of Russia, although the Russian government has denied any involvement, and there is notable uncertainty popping up about where the group is thought to be located in Eastern Europe. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis said he would pardon any Floridian who had violated a mask or social distancing mandate introduced over the course of the pandemic in his state. In international news, Israel has been striking Gaza from land, sea, and air, with the known Palestinian death toll rising to 119 so far. 9 Israelis have died during the conflict. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the ongoing siege of Gaza will, quote, continue as long as it takes, end quote. The U.S. military has evacuated upwards of 120 military personnel from Israel who were in the country for a routine planning conference. Israel has also seen more civil unrest, with Arab and Jewish Israelis fighting, and some rumors circulating that the Israeli police forces are allowing Jewish Israeli gangs to target Arabs living in Israel. The police have denied this, instead blaming Arabs for most of the problems. Lebanon is losing 1/4 of its power supply after a Turkish company that supplies power from shipboard generators decided to cut service because Lebanon is in payment arrears, the government that is. And over in Ireland, Ireland's health service has shut down its computer system after it was the victim of another severe ransomware attack. Following the Colonial Pipeline one earlier this week, that attack has affected both local computer systems for Ireland's health service and those for the health services of the country as a whole. Vaccines are still being given, although many routine visits and non-severe cases are being delayed as the staff is busy switching back paper records. And SpaceX, which had its first successful test flight of its Starship, the name of the Starship is literally Starship, is now planning for a Starship prototype to enter into orbit. They're planning the process of having a Starship prototype, again, the prototype for one of these starships, entering into orbit sometime soon. They're planning that. Anyway, it's a brief headline, but there are only, it lasts a lot longer than it should just because I have to keep qualifying. I mean a Starship. The name of the Starship is Starship, which I guess is what they're going for. That is their branding. Anyway, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I want to go back to Governor Ron DeSantis saying that he would pardon any Floridian.
Yeah. What does that incentivize?
Well, what does that incentivize? But here's the thing. You know, that's him putting his flag in the ground, so to speak.
Yeah.
I kind of like it in my own way.
Yeah.
I mean, because you disincentivize behavior during the crisis, and then it's like, okay, that was a bit much maybe. I'm sorry I grounded you. Take a 20, you're scot-free, go have fun with your friends. That kind of thing. I don't know what it is, but like, you know, somebody oversteps and they decide, okay, I'm not gonna charge you with this.
Give you a pass.
Now, was it an overstep in the first place?
No. I don't think it was. I mean, we are almost at 600,000 deaths. Now, if we were in a country and there was 1,000 deaths, then yes, be like, oh, dude, that one guy doesn't give you enough reason to put all of these people in their houses. So fair enough. Like, severity is kind of governed just based on the environment that we found ourselves in. No, with that many deaths and that many people losing their lives, no, I expect a certain action to be taken. And I think all of us on some level expect a certain action to be taken with the number of deaths going up like that. But again, that depends on how many deaths. And, you know, they just came out with the ruling saying, all right, you guys don't have to wear masks. Now, beforehand, Fauci was like, people are going to have to wear masks in 2022, maybe 2030, maybe forever. Like, he was there. And then all of a sudden, people don't have to wear masks. I think the rationale and the reason is because they saw the vaccine rollout slowing down, and they don't want that. And so they're trying to create incentives that egg people on into getting vaccinated. And one of those incentives is, what if you don't have to wear a mask? What if when you go into buildings, you can go back into those restaurants, you can have that normal life? Does that incentivize people? Does that up the amount of people who get vaccinated? Yes, of course it is. And so it's like they're trying to create incentive for those people, because when you think about it, how do you know who's vaccinated and who's not?
You have no idea.
Building?
You don't.
There's no idea.
Yeah, you can't get a vaccine passport tramp stamp.
Right.
As far as I know.
Right.
Although some people might be trying.
Or like they just put a magnetic thing over you to test the metals of the vaccine when you walk in. It says, okay, you're a transponder. No, it's not that.
All great business ideas, by the way.
Yeah, they don't
Administration
know.
should be doing it.
Right,
you should sell this stuff.
A vaccine tramp stamp.
A vaccine tramp stamp to Jeff Bezos. He would personally apply, administer the vaccine tattoo.
Yeah, there's no way for them to know. Like when I heard them say that, and I was like, how do you know? If you walk into a restaurant, how do you know? Unless they're basically saying, if you don't have a vaccine at this point, you're fair game. And so if you want to take your life into your own hands and walk in.
If you were wearing Google Glass, maybe that could tell you, you know?
When you can see it on the individual, something like that.
Popping up Black Mirror style. You get to see their credit score at the same time, and their most recent girlfriend and how the relationship ended, and their most recent Google search.
I think it would be more like Attica, where you take a skin sample, and then you go and get the DNA read and be like, all right, that guy has a history of so-and-so, and you know, he didn't get his vaccine.
At one point, I don't know if I was weirdly prescient or what, but I got really worried about not just chemical warfare, but, you know, biological development, bioengineering, and the threats of it in general. And I was like, okay, 50 years from now, are people just going to be constantly trying to wipe each other out with these things? Where does that leave us? And then I was like, maybe Darth Vader wasn't so crazy after all. Being in a skin suit with like ventilators built into the mask.
He didn't have a choice.
I think that's the way.
Because he loved it.
That's the thing. He didn't do it because he loved it. He did it because, well, not only
his skills weren't up to snuff.
Injuries he went through, but yeah, he could have used the force to like keep the viruses away, but he didn't know how to. It just wasn't that attentive. Anyway.
You know, speaking of that, Stargate, in one of the episodes, they pulled this woman out of the ice. She's been in the ice for God knows how long. and she's just below an ancient, meaning she hasn't gotten to the point where she ascended yet. But
Ascended
she
to
was,
what?
Well, they in Stargate, you have the capacity of ascended beings, meaning humanity gets to the point where they become so enlightened that they transcend this physical plane of existence.
How much does that cost?
Well, right there, it's the issue that a person who ascends wouldn't see it as cost. They would transcend above costing.
But wait, I was joking. Can you literally pay for it?
No, you can't.
Okay, good. You just mean sacrifice in terms of
No, you
actions.
can't
What's
pay
the
for it.
cost, Jamarl?
No. In their case, like one of the wild episodes was the guy. They made the point of saying this has nothing to do with good and bad, meaning there have been people who ascended who were horrible, horrible people. But the thing is, once you ascend, you can't use that ability in regards to that physical reality. Like you're limited by the other ascended beings because they believe you shouldn't intercede. It's really interesting. But she had a virus, and she was keeping the virus at bay based on like just her higher sensibilities and consciousness or whatever else. But eventually it got to her. But no, I do think when something dramatic is taking place, if we were in a war and in that war they said, okay, people need to cut their lights on at night or else we will potentially shoot you, but definitely take you to jail. And somebody says, well, I want my freedom. And I want the freedom to cut my light on at night. Well, they're saying that because if there's a bombing raid and you cut your light on, you allow your enemy to see basically where you are on the ground and allow. So you doing that creates a higher propensity for potential your neighbors and people around you to basically get murdered all at once in a bombing strike.
What about after the war's over? What if you didn't turn your light off?
Well,
And
that's
where
the
we
catch.
get?
Do you keep those people in jail?
Yeah.
Afterwards. Now you could say, well, those people didn't care about the other people that were around them. You could say that, those people should have followed the law, and going forward, we need to make sure that people understand that there are consequences.
Yeah.
It depends on how you
Whether you insult the person or whether you describe on a deep level. If you try to give people an altruistic sense of this is what this person did wrong and this is why our punishment is justified, etc. Yeah, you get into problems. Well, it was wartime.
Yeah.
And it was wartime. Like you can kind of hit it from those different perspectives. And of course, that all applies to a pandemic. But setting aside that whole conversation, what I feel should be noted as obvious about this is that this is a pretty good political move for Governor Ron DeSantis. As a Republican, being able to go through the crisis, you do the lockdowns, you do the mask mandates, you do the social distancing stuff, you get the hammer, you drop down the rate of transmission. That does your state pretty well.
And then you come out.
And then you come out and you're like, and there's amnesty.
Yeah.
There's amnesty for everybody. You know what I mean?
And all of the Trump supporters
and all
are
those
like,
exactly. And all the Trump supporters are like, this dude gets it or something like that.
Yeah.
This was all unnecessary, which is what they think.
Yeah.
And he finally sees it.
Yeah.
And he's in support of us. And now, you know what I mean? You get exactly what I'm saying.
It's good politics.
Yeah.
It's extremely good politics if you're Ron DeSantis. I mean, especially if the numbers stay down. Because at this point, the CDC has basically said you can go back into restaurants and whatnot. So from DeSantis' point, all right, well, this is over with. COVID has been beat. Let's get back to some level of normal semblance.
It's not like, here's the thing. It's not as if there's a crime that we've overturned since then. It's not like, you're overturning people's drug sentences. These mandates were in place for a period of time for a purpose that it would be, you brought
the
up.
purpose is made, basically.
Yeah, you brought up the wartime example. That's a good one. The other one that came to me is, okay, so say you're on the freeway and you're driving through a work zone where you're supposed to slow down an extra, 20 miles per hour or whatever.
Yeah.
And you drive through that at full speed and a cop pulls you over on the other side and gives you a ticket. And then later, a couple of weeks or months or whatever, they take that ticket away. Well, but you were doing something you shouldn't have been doing. Right. Even if you didn't hurt anybody while you were in that.
Yeah.
It's still a law.
Yeah.
It was just during this period of space that you were traveling through that there was this, additional
Temporal
law that you
period
needed
of
to
time.
follow.
That was this, yeah.
Yeah, and we're not rebelling against the idea by whatever, we see that as justified, the process of slowing down in work zones. Now, this is a lot more complicated.
Yes.
Are lockdowns during the pandemic
Yes.
justified? That's where all the confusion comes from. But yeah, the timing with Governor Ron DeSantis and the CDC letting people wear masks if they've been vaccinated, very well timed.
Yes. And like I said, the politics is good. Even for Joe Biden, the politics is good.
Yeah.
Because, I think early on, there was going to be this moment where there was a conflict that was going to take place between the people who get vaccinated versus the people who didn't get vaccinated. If all of us are under threat, all of us can get sick, then if Joe Biden or somebody else says, okay, we need you guys to stay indoors, we accept that. The majority of the population says, okay, fair enough. We don't want to get sick. We get it. Rationale makes sense. But the moment that you get, let's say 50% of the public is vaccinated, I think we're around that, maybe 50%. And those people are like, I don't want to stay indoors. I don't want to have to wear the mask. I don't want to have, at that point, it's more individualistic because at that point, that individual has done something. Well, why didn't those people get vaccinated? Why should I have to stay in the house just because those people didn't get vaccinated? It becomes that. And so Joe Biden's way of dealing with that is, if you're vaccinated, have fun. Congratulations. And the other people, it incentivizes those people to do the same.
Maybe.
I think it's good politics.
I hear you, but at the same time, remember when Biden was talking about, and one day soon, you may be even be able, by July 4th, you may be able to have a barbecue in your backyard. You remember what I'm talking about, right? That's kind of discordant with the current laissez-faire policy. I don't know. We got to go into
speed it up.
Yeah, he does. Well, and it's been working pretty well. You know, we're doing as far as anyway. We got to go to a break, but yeah, vaccination in the States has been rolling through with expeditiously. Got to go to a break though. We'll be back with Larry Sanger on the other side of this short break, co-founder of Wikipedia, founder of the Knowledge Standards Foundation, and author of a new book. We'll be back with Larry on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are talking science and politics. And I'm also going to bring academia into this. This is following the news of a new panel from the Biden administration, a task force which is looking into removing politics from science. Now, you can see this as a response to Donald Trump. You could also see this as a deep, pivotal, and historical question, which is how do you remove the influence of human affairs, pursuit of power, from what we now see should be independent processes, the human mind exploring the universe, trying to use logic, deduction, and fact to give us lessons, in natural history, natural laws, and even philosophy, religion, potentially, things like that. In academia and social sciences in general, what role does politics play? For that conversation, we are joined by Larry Sanger. He's the co-founder of Wikipedia, also an author, and a founder of the Knowledge Standards Foundation. His new book, by the way, and I want to ask him about it to start us off, Essays on Free Knowledge, The Origins of Wikipedia and the New Politics of Knowledge. Larry, thank you for joining us. Where can people find that book? When did you come out with it? And what can they find in it, just to set our conversation off on the right start?
Hey, well, thanks for having me again. And the book came out just last fall, and it's on Amazon. You can find the ebook on Gumroad, and you can find the audiobook on Audible. So
that's great.
Different ways to get it now. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you. And again, co-founder of Wikipedia, author of a book with that title and premise, the idea of free knowledge. I will hand it over to you from the start. Can we, should we, is it possible or desirable to try to separate politics from science? And I guess a little bit more locally, proximally, do you see the Biden administration being able to do it? But whichever way you want to approach it, Larry, what's your take?
Well, it's all very disturbing to me. It would look dangerously naive if we didn't know exactly what they were up to. Basically, as I see it, the Biden administration is trying to set up new ways to make it possible for a technocracy to operate. And that ultimately is a tool of totalitarianism. And what technocracy means, it isn't just rule of like a technological elite. It's a rule of those who have specialized knowledge, of experts, in other words. And the problem about it is that as soon as politics is involved in deciding any question, scientific or otherwise, then the question becomes political for that reason. There's no way to take politics out of politicized scientific questions. It's just impossible. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true.
Agreed.
Especially when you're talking about policy making. But what they pretend to be able to do, and it's merely a pretense, and they know it. Everybody knows it. But it's like you're not allowed to say it. What they pretend to be able to do is to make decisions that are informed strictly by science. But that's they don't talk about the policy and ideology considerations that lie behind their conclusions. And then what they can do is simply enshrine as the world's greatest experts the people who agree with them.
I see what you mean. So basically, they could say, these are our high priests, these scientists, these men who know reality and so forth. And because we've separated science from politics, you can tell that this high priest is giving you an independent, unbiased, unvarnished view of reality. And so we're going to defer to that guy now in regards to going forward. I agree with you. I don't think there is a way of separating it. I mean, the moment that you have a capitalist system that incentivizes cash as being, you know, the guiding star, well, if something comes up that is antagonistic to that point of view, meaning environment, for example, and you say, okay, well, it's going to cost $10 trillion to get our environment. I'm just pulling a number out of a hat. Well, if you are a company that's going to be adversely affected by that, every incentive in the world in our political system is for you to put $1 into a politician's pocket, for you to run a credit card through Joe Biden or one of his staff's G-strings, and for you to try to influence those people to go out and, you know, pass policy, or for that matter, hold up policy that is against your interests. Like it becomes automatic just based on the game space, the rule set of that game space. That's why I don't think you can necessarily do it. But to be fair to Joe Biden, though, it seems like they're looking into depoliticizing it. And I got to be honest, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to try. I mean, because think about what takes place currently. The climate change thing is a good example, where these guys would say, you know, like Joe Biden right now on the issue of oil and gas. Well, are you going to pass more contracts when you know, as a flat fact, going based on scientific opinion, that passing more of those things get us closer to an endpoint in regards to climate? So how can you approve of another pipeline? But he will approve of that another pipeline. Should there be a separation between science and politics? I mean, maybe, like, I guess what I'm saying is it wrong for him to even try?
Let me make a distinction here. It's possible to do science, even on politicized scientific questions like global warming. It's possible to do that science in a non-political way. It's difficult, and I think you know, you might have special funding challenges if you take the wrong side, a politically unpopular side. But that's possible, and that wasn't really my point. In other words, the science is not the thing that's politicized, not at root. That's not the point. The point is that the policy issues that are informed by science will always continue to be policy issues. They'll continue to be politicized. And then the science is then marshaled as a tool.
And there's always a need to capture the vehicle by which science as an abstract noun and process.
It's not about doing that. I mean, just look at how Fauci's opinions have changed over the last year. And initially, you know, he was taking the traditional stance toward masks, that there's the science is not only not settled, but it looks like they don't really help at all. And then the whole administration and much of the rest of the world turned seemingly on a dime. It's very strange, a couple of weeks. And suddenly the advice changed, as if, and this advice was coming from scientists.
Yeah, well, and here's the we can. I think we're on. I think you and I are on the different sides of the mask thing, but we can disagree on that or whatever, while simultaneously agreeing that it was clear that that was a highly politicized process. That every decision that Fauci made as a public health administrator, but also a sort of I'm trying to think of the name of the kind of religious figure, but an intermediary, the kind of figure that relays to you scientific information, gives you the body of that information, and helps to put you in connect with that ultimate truth, supposedly. He was always subject to the needs of the political situation that he was in. But there are two things here. On the relationship between science and politics, the politically expedient way to view that relationship, in my opinion, is to believe that there can be and that there should be a divide between the two. The most politically, what most people fall on. Some people will say, no, science and politics, politics should govern science in some reason. That's gained some popularity recently. But it seems to me that most people still think science and politics should be separate in roughly the same way, and for similar reasons, that they believe that in American politics, church and state should be separate. That you shouldn't have this undue influence from one sphere of life in the other that might corrupt the processes of the other, and that you might ruin the both by trying to mix the two. That's the political baseline as far as I can tell. But if you view it more scientifically, it seems to me that in a sort of linear, complex system sense, it's inevitable that science is going to be politicized, that at pretty much every turn, depending on how you define science, depending on how you define politics, it's either literally always going to happen, because science is our human way of understanding the universe, and we as humans are always going to believe our pursuit of power, our defense of our power, all those things into what we choose to look at, how we choose to look at it. That's sort of the post-structuralist or the critical way of seeing it. But I don't think we should settle on that tautology. Let me step back for a second. There are better and worse ways to depoliticize science. What do you think should be done now? If you had to make changes, how would you remove some of the political trappings from the modern scientific process? How do you think it would change academia and the status of the public intellect, or the status of this sort of person who's able to speak with the knowledge of science and set the agenda in the American conversation? What would you change, and what do you think that change would bring? Larry?
It ain't going to happen, because in a totalitarian society, everything is in the state, everything is subject to power, in other words. And unfortunately, when the universities became themselves politicized, when they started openly declaring that they had activist goals in many departments, then that sort of trickled up to the administration. Maybe it trickled down from the administration. In any case, the universities now are deeply politicized. People at the universities don't like talking about it, but it's true. And that applies increasingly to hard science. And of course, there are sort of political aspects of the business of research. Just having a job is a big status symbol. There's all kinds of unemployed PhDs in science. It's a big problem. So,
but Larry, and we only have a minute or two more with you, and this is a fascinating enough conversation. We could have had you on for half an hour, but there's a lot of news today, and thank you for joining us. You just said it's impossible. You don't see it happening. But here's the thing: every society, as far as I can tell, to the best of its abilities, has pursued power. Every society, in its own way, even if they're parochial, has been a kind of totalitarian society. And there's a sort of scale that we can walk along as our societies grow more capable. And yet, in some societies, they have created better and worse forms of science, better and more accurate ways of objectively finding the truth. Why do you see that not happening here? Why can't we make it better here?
No, I'm going to disagree with your premise entirely. I think that for a long time, and in certain respects, throughout much of the 20th century in the West, the research establishment really was independent of the political establishment. research started being heavily funded by politicians and by politicized foundations.
I would make that same case. I would make that same case, but I would say that that's because our society has grown to become more totalitarian. It has grown into its abilities. And the modern, specifically in America, but you could just see the modern sort of more developed westernized state. If you compare that to, for instance, the aristocratic sort of mid-feudal, post-feudal societies of the 1700s, what you had was an independent intellectual class of elites who asserted themselves and created a kind of intelligentsia. But they were a political class. They were aristocratic. These weren't peasants we're talking about. They could have been, theoretically, if they'd been given the training. That's another conversation. But the point is, you had an independent aristocracy that existed in the political system, had its own weight, and was able to throw itself up against the monarchy. And I was talking about this with Jamarl the other day. This is why, if you look at, for instance, the Royal Society of England, the chief institute academically for hundreds of years there, even though they were associated tight at the waist with the British monarchy, you had a kind of independent political class which was able to steer itself, get its own things done. But that was still political. There was still a political class there at a high level. It was just that there was a sort of balance of powers between the aristocrats and the monarchs. I could see something like that happening here. I just don't know where it's going to come from. What do you agree, disagree with in there, Larry?
I mean, look, the problem is that our intelligentsia today, that's a term that we don't use that much anymore.
Yeah.
Interesting, isn't it? It has become deeply politicized, and there are just way too many people in there who are ready to change their views based on what is politically expedient.
Based on the way the winds are blowing. 100%. That's what defines it now. And I think we share a skepticism, a cynicism, and a kind of disgust about the degradation of that. We've got to close it here, though. We got our next guest on. Larry, thank you for joining us, particularly after such a long time. I believe it's been like 15 months since we last had you on the show under different hosts. So thank you for joining Jamarl and I this morning. Great conversation.
Absolutely.
And hopefully again soon. That was Larry Sanger, co-founder of Wikipedia and founder of the Knowledge Standards Foundation, also the author of a new book you can and should check out on Amazon, Gumroad, other sources, Essays on Free Knowledge, The Origins of Wikipedia, and the New Politics of Knowledge. That is, again, co-founder of Wikipedia, Larry Sanger. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into our break, but we'll be back in a minute with Miko Peled, talking about Netanyahu and Israeli politics, specifically during this ongoing armed and violent crisis. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're joined by Miko Peled, human rights activist and author of the books The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, and Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. And by the way, you can and should follow Miko on Twitter at Miko Peled, buy his books on Amazon, and learn more about him and his work by going to mikopeled.com. That's MIKOPELED.com. Miko, thank you for joining us. Clearly a lot to talk about, and we've been talking about it all morning. The ongoing armed rebellion is the sort of more Israeli-friendly way to look at it, I guess, by Palestinians against Israel, by Hamas specifically. So we like to talk about it. Or siege of Gaza is another way to look at it, with Israel killing more than 10 times as many Palestinians as Israelis have been killed, knocking down multi-story apartment buildings that have been allegedly this site, the home of Hamas militants. This whole thing, this is an ongoing armed conflict. And this comes as the politics of Israel are, as ever, in a state of disarray. Miko, we last had you on last week to talk about the fate of Benjamin Netanyahu as he prepares to potentially hand the reins over to the leadership of a competitor in the Israeli government. You said that he was effectively taking a back seat, as he does from time to time, and would soon reassert himself. How does this change that? How do the events of earlier this week, how do they change Netanyahu's fate? What do you think he's doing with this? Where do you think this is coming from for him? And again, in terms of his success, his failure, what do you think this does for Benjamin Netanyahu? Miko Peled.
Well, thanks for having me on the show again, guys. Look, the two things I'll say. Number one, the negotiations to form an alternative government without Netanyahu just collapsed yesterday. So Netanyahu is still on his way to remaining prime minister. One of the main players pulled away, and he's very likely he's going to be sitting in a coalition government with Netanyahu as prime minister. And that was to be expected. There's no way Netanyahu is going to allow anybody else to become prime minister. Number two, this is to a large degree as a result of this violence, of the violence that we're seeing, which was orchestrated by Netanyahu. Every step of the way, Netanyahu knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that during a time of such grave crisis, people were not going to allow anybody else to take a seat, because basically I think Israelis and Israeli politicians, and particularly the very, very large, what they call the right coalition, right with a capital R, want him to remain prime minister, and they know that he's going to serve them best. So this is the reality. He orchestrated the violence. He orchestrated this what is happening right now. He's smiling all the way to the bank, if you will, to remaining prime minister. And that's exactly, things are playing out exactly as he wanted and as I think was to be expected. And he's going to remain prime minister.
But
there's no question about that.
Orchestrated comes across, and Miko, thank you for joining us. Orchestrated comes across as if it's planned, as if one step along the way Netanyahu is doing X or Y in order to foment events. Israel expropriates land pretty much all the time, in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood that they were talking about taking seems to be one of the, let's say, the primary event that instigated much of this. I mean, yes, the mosque itself and then attacking during Ramadan, but at the end of the day, the expropriation and the forcible removal of families from that neighborhood and this kind of ethnic cleansing, that seemed to be the thing that was the ensuing act to inspire all of this. To say Netanyahu orchestrated it, are you saying that he used that as a pressure point? Like, what? How far does orchestrate go in this context?
Well, first of all, accelerating the process and just it off. The extreme violence in the mosque in al-aqsa during Ramadan, gentlemen, I don't know if you can appreciate the Armageddon-esque, aspect of this. Israeli forces attacking, never mind Jerusalem, which is horrible enough. Never mind other parts of the old city, which is horrible enough. But in al-aqsa during Ramadan, while people are praying, this is. I don't even know how to put it in words. And
the gravity can't be understated.
He has the ability to ratchet it up, or he has the ability to calm things down. He's the prime minister. There's a minister for Jerusalem affairs, which sits in his cabinet, who is one of these dangerous neo-fascist right-wing religious nuts who wants to see al-Aqsa burned to the ground. And the sights of these Israeli youth dancing in the plaza, right where where the Western Wall is, and by the way, a plaza that was built on the ashes, on the ruins of the homes of thousands of Palestinians that used to live there. Until 1967, that was an entire neighborhood that was flattened immediately after East Jerusalem was taken in 1967, flattened completely. The people were not given any notice. They had to flee, and this enormous plaza was built precisely for this reason. So to see thousands of young Israelis dancing and chanting while there were flames up in the al-Aqsa compound, this is Armageddon, and this is precisely what Netanyahu wanted the world to see. Because who better equipped, who better experienced, who is the better statesman? No one is better than him at, dealing with this. And of course it was expected that Palestinians in Gaza would stand up and say, what are you doing to the mosque? And the firing from Gaza was perfectly expected. And in fact, they gave an ultimatum. They warned. They said, if you don't stop attacking Jerusalem, if you don't stop the attacks on al-aqsa, we will attack. And he did not. Of course, he was very happy to have them start this. So this entire escalation was, I believe, planned very meticulously by Netanyahu. He's a master Machiavellian. He is the devil without even a disguise. And this is all this is all good for him because he gets to remain in power, which is really the only thing he cares about.
I want to, this is actually relating to, we've been talking about this all morning, but this relates to two conversations that we had earlier. I'm going to choose the most recent one, which was with Jonathan Katab, who was saying that he has seen a shift in the public's opinion about the issue of Israel over the course of, I think he gave the last 15 years, but I believe it just, over the course of his life. He's saying an opening up of people being willing, at least in the public field, in the public square, to criticize Israel, to have sort of passionate conversations back and forth about the issue, and it gets nuanced fairly quickly when you do that. But he said also, as I'm sure you see, that in the upper class, in the 1%, if you had to use a term, it's a lot harder to have that conversation, and you hear a lot less of it. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, Miko, whether you're looking at not necessarily the Israeli public, although you could include them, the American public that you see, and when you compare that with how the elites in our country and Israel and other countries have this conversation, has it changed for you? What do you think is the current state of that, if you had to define it, Miko?
Well, I know Jonathan. I respect him, but if he's seeing positive change, then he's seeing something that I'm not seeing at all. The only change I've seen in times of Israeli society is that the discourse has become more open, and the discourse, it's much more acceptable to talk the way to say what Israelis think, which is what we're seeing now. They support it 110%. There's very little insignificant opposition to what is happening right now, this massive assault against Palestinians everywhere. There has been no change in action. There's been a change in discourse where they're much more openly talking about it and screaming death to Arabs and stuff like that. Here in America, I think America is still very committed, including American society. While we do see changes in the fringe a little bit, and we do see some liberal politicians like Bernie and maybe Elizabeth Warren condemning what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah, we don't see any action. They're still totally committed to a Zionist ideology, and a Zionist ideology is expressed in what we're seeing now being done to Palestinians. There is no other Zionism. When Joe Biden says, I'm a Zionist, we can expect that he will sit around and allow Israel to massacre and slaughter and evict and deport and arrest and torture. I have a friend who is an Israeli citizen, a Palestinian Israeli citizen, who I spoke to yesterday. He had just come out of 3 days of interrogation by the Israeli secret police. He's all beaten up, he's got bruises all over his head. He's a Palestinian citizen of Israel. So when you're a Zionist, you support the darkest, most violent, most brutal, most racist aspects of humanity, and it's being expressed in Palestine right now. So
Miko, how the hell did those cultural barriers work? Because I asked you that question. You responded from the point of view of the Israeli public. You'd already represented the Israeli government's perspective, and then we turned to the elites in America. What we didn't include in that conversation was the American public, which is less relevant than the others, admittedly, to what Israel is actually going to do in this situation. But I'm curious about the barrier between these two ways of seeing things. You're describing in Israel the obvious predominance of Zionism and how that has led people to accept what the Israeli government's doing here. I think there's a lot less acceptance in the States. And so whether it's in airports when people meet each other across these lines, whether it's in Israeli schools, which we've had you on to talk about before, and the education process, I can imagine a pretty strong conversation between two people representing these views. And I know that a lot of those are happening right now. But if you had to give a representation of how is it that Israel has been able to maintain that commitment, that Zionism, to use a single word for it, culturally, how has that worked? And what does that look like? Miko?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What do you mean, how?
It's a little bit of a confusing question. But if you had to think of a conversation, if you had to think about how they were able to do that, I don't know how else to put it. Because it is in schools, and culturally. Like I'm trying to get a sense from the outside because it seems hard to me to accept. But we're all in our bubbles. And so I imagine that because you
how do they propagate the Zionist ideology?
Exactly.
As it goes through, like, is it through schools? Is it through just reinforcement and work?
Yeah, it's everything. It's the schools, it's the media, it's the popular culture, it's the discourse at home. I mean, talking about Arabs being dirty and lazy and stupid, and killing all the Arabs. I mean, this is
really
complete national discourse.
That is killing all the Arabs. Discourse. Wait a second, because that is categorically way the hell outside of everything else. It just superiority is vile on its own. Ethnic superiority is rightfully seen, in my opinion, as vile enough on its own. But you're talking about genocide at the end there. How
absolutely.
How accepted is that?
It's not something it's not outrageous at all. Perfectly acceptable to talk, to tell jokes about stuff like that.
So when you talk about the conversation opening up in Israel and it shifting in one direction, that is, Bradley, the direction you're saying it shifted in. It's that side is opened up.
It's shifted in a way that now they talk about it openly, as opposed to before they just did it and they pretended there was a segment of Israeli society that was embarrassed to talk like this. Now that segment is barely existing.
And how? Because I was thinking there was no left in Israel from the standpoint of the political stuff. From your standpoint, and we have to close this out, but where does this go? from the way you look at the world on this, and I've asked a few people this because I'm curious about the different perspectives. But in my head, this looks like Little America that's forming a colony where it's this kind of mirror image of something that's taking place now. Where does this go from your standpoint? Where does, the Israeli government in the way that it's positioned itself, the public in the way that it's positioned itself, there doesn't necessarily seem to be anybody that pulls back or that believes Palestinians have a right to self-defense. So how does this end?
Well, I'm hopping on a plane. I'm going to be there this weekend, and so I'll be better equipped to talk to you about that if you want once I'm there, and maybe even have some Palestinians that you can talk to if you'd like. But
that sounds great, Miko. Thank you for the offer.
Yeah, sure. But I would say that, I think we're going to see things that we've not seen before. I think we're very close to a place where we're going to see a clear winner and a clear loser. I don't think this is another outbreak of violence, as as people like to categorize these things. This is much broader, much wider. It's all-encompassing in terms of Palestinian society. In other words, Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, Palestinians in Jerusalem, Palestinians everywhere are standing up and protesting. Israel is desecrating al-aqsa, which is outrageous even for Israel. In other words, it's unprecedented even for Israel to do this during Ramadan. So everybody's pulling all the stops. I don't think we're going to see an end to this anytime soon, and when we do, there's going to be, I believe, a clear winner and a clear loser. It's going to be a game changer. I think this is the beginning of something we can't even begin to anticipate.
But you can't tell right now which side that will be. Who will be the winner and who will be the loser?
Well, I think that the Palestinians are, besides being on the right side of the issue, are far more resilient, far more dedicated, far more principled, and therefore have a much better chance of winning this than the Israelis do.
Miko, we've got to close. Thank you for joining us. Great conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. For those listening, that was Miko Peled, human rights activist and author of The General Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine and Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. You can follow Miko on Twitter at Miko Peled, buy his books on Amazon, and learn more about him and his work by going to mikopeled.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are going into a break, and we'll be back on the other side of this break, taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Be right back in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, taking your calls in our rap segment, the last segment of our show today, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Towards the end of our interview with Miko Paletta, I asked a kind of broad question, and he asked me to clarify. And we got into it. And he got to the interesting part that I wanted to get to, basically, which is, what are they actually saying? How did this happen? And something I would love to get into when we have him back on, as he offered to come back on, potentially as soon as next week, to keep talking about this. Here's part of where I wanted to go. If you imagine a conversation between a devout Israeli, and not even, I'm using the word devout, even though often they're not particularly religious about it,
right?
But somebody who's, ardent Zionist, wed to the state, and able to say with, not a hint of uncertainty in their voice, something like, all Arabs in Israel or all Arabs should be killed, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
What allows them to have that thought? What other thoughts support that thought? I want to get a sense, not because I want to think that, of course, but because it seems incredibly important to know, how the hell do they prop that statement up? How do they allow themselves to obscure from themselves the moral, drama and weight of that choice? How many people's lives they would be ending and affecting, and all of that? What is it goes through their head?
When people say that, do they really mean each and every one? Like, is it that literal? Oftentimes, I don't know if it's that literal, but the sentiment is still there, regardless of whether it's that literal or not. Look, I think it's the friction of the environment. I think I don't think it's something that happens in the abstract, where you're just sitting back and you're looking at it, etc. I think it's you identify yourself with that state of Israel. It's not religious. It's maybe it is religious in the way that you have this kind of quasi devotion to this kind of conceptual thing, but I think it's that, and then you add in opposition. That opposition being, there's land that we want, that these people are on, and these people are angry that we're taking their land, but we're angry that they're just not giving up their land. Like, why can't they get over it? They've lost this conflict, etc. It's a frozen conflict where somebody has something that somebody else wants. And it's that constantly, years, decades. And if you were born into it, what do you think? Like, if you're born into that and a rocket hits your family, let's say a rocket killed your mom, that these guys shot off several years ago, what are you thinking? Are you thinking of, well, I mean, we are taking their land, and there's this kind of conflict going on.
No, it's just your family. It's just the threat to your family and your community.
Exactly.
And you seeing those rockets almost hitting, and you feeling protected because the Iron Dome's keeping them away. I hear you on that, but at the same time, I can't. If I were to say a set of words that to somebody else were to sound, I would like to sound absolutely ridiculous to somebody else. Yeah. I would like to think, and I would be wrong, that I would see the error in my ways, and I would understand it, because that sounds absolutely insane to me.
That's a gut emotion.
That sounds. I hear you, but that, like, even the irony, just the terrible, bitter betrayal of the knowledge that the Holocaust is a moral disaster that happened, and that it was the result of one group of people looking at another group of people genocidally, saying they should all die because they're the cause of X and Y and Z problems.
And to turn around and then do the same thing as somebody else.
Yeah.
But see, that I don't know if they...
4 calls, by the way.
Oh, geez. Let's get to calls.
Let's
go to calls.
Because we've got about 7 minutes at this point. We got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. Free Julian Assange. I'd like to say China had came out with something yesterday. China expresses a high degree of concern regarding the situation between Palestine and Israel. Foreign Minister spokeswoman Hu Chuling had addressed and also said, however, due to the obstruction of individual countries, no agreement has been reached so far, added Hu. The Security Council should take action to reiterate its commitments to and affirm support for the two-state solution. So, and also, it's China's turn to be the rotating president for the Security Council this month too. So that's somebody in the pocket for the Palestinians that's promoting peace and want to stop what's going on over there. And I have to say, I have to support the BDS movement, because that's the only way we can prevent a wider conflict. We got to put pressure on Israel government. I'm not saying the Israeli people, but the Israeli government, and we got to stop this, because this is getting out of control. You got people outside the Jordan border and Lebanese bought and lined up against the fence with signs protesting, and they have to run back home because they're being shot at and stuff. So it's unifying. It's unifying that area. And this the guy you had on before, he's right. It could get worse. So we got to stop this. We got to, ask for peace in the world, man. That's all I want to say.
Agreed. Frankly, agreed, Tarif. Yeah, the BDS idea, the boycott, divestment, sanctions policy. It kind of, I would go in two directions with this. We got more callers. So I want to be quick. One, the thought process for a lot of people, I don't see that making sense. The goal is to get large players to implement those policies. Like, for instance, nation states. If you had around the world a wave of countries levying sanctions against Israel in the same way that the United States was levying sanctions against almost everybody else, that would be pressure. And what that would actually do is an open question, but that would be significant pressure. And that's, of course, just the last S of the BDS movement. There are other parts of that too, and that's where boycotting products coming from Israel. That's where it's a little bit more distributed. But at the same time, it reminds me of a lot of the response to climate change isn't just, and it shouldn't be primarily, for individual consumers to change their habits. You need larger companies, corporations, governments, et cetera, coming together, working this stuff out. BDS would have worked though, but I guess where I would go at that is any individual person doing that is only going to be so effective. What you really need are governments.
It's like recycling.
Yeah.
And it's like, I always tell my wife, I was like, yeah, you doing it. Like, and putting the responsibility on the individuals themselves is not going to be enough to fix
But I like it.
Yeah.
I like recycling.
Well, that's what I tell her. Like, there's nothing wrong with it, and it's a good thing, but that's not going to be the thing that fixes it.
It's true. It's just a cognitive dissonance, getting rid of that sense of niggling doubt, that idea of, wow, should I be doing this? Is this right? But we have more callers, and I'm going to go to them. We have Karen calling in from Maryland. Karen, you're on. Got about 30 seconds here. What's on your mind?
Okay, well, this isn't going to take too long. Let me make a quick comment that I advocate for mashed potatoes rather than hash browns for breakfast. But the reason that I called is that are you all keeping tabs and keeping us updated on the recount and the audit results that are going on?
We haven't been talking about it in Arizona. No, we have been painfully neglecting that one.
Election is over.
As an alternative news source that I am willing to listen to, you should keep our
listeners informed of that.
Updated.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the push on that. I'm in agreement. We should do it. And I personally would prefer hash browns to mashed potatoes, but that's just apples and oranges at that point to some extent. We have more calls. I want to go to them. Karen, thank you for the call. We have Pam calling in from Virginia. Pam, you're on. What's going on?
Thank you. 2 points regarding why are people advocating genocide or do they become abusive? People who have been abused and suffered abuse often become abusive.
I had the same
thought.
Well known.
It's done deliberately, like Skull and Bones and military academies, how they harass their fraternities or trainees.
That's the whole hazing thing. Yeah, is that you increase group identity by putting them. It almost reminds me of the Benjamin Franklin thing about how if you want to ingratiate yourself to somebody, you ask them to do you a favor, and that's counterintuitive. You ask them to help you, and they're supposed to like you more. Well, it's because they're willing to justify helping you. Therefore, they kind of convince themselves on some level that they like you. Because why would they help you if they didn't like you? Well, in a weird way, with hazing, why would you be willing to stand up to this abuse if you weren't willing to if you didn't have some respect for the person that was abusing you? It's a weird way to maintain these hierarchies of power. And what's screwed up about it, of course, is when it's completely involuntary and when it just perpetuates cycles of generational abuse, as does appear to be the case with Israel and Palestine. I thought of that earlier too, Pam. I guess I was just hesitant. I don't know. I'm hesitant because
people hurt people, man.
Well, it's true, but I also don't want to make it about Judaism because I do not believe that Israel is fundamentally related to Judaism in anything other than its own words.
Yeah,
I think that's important, and I think that Rabbi Shapiro made that very clear earlier on. Anyway, Pam, thank you for the call. We got Sam calling in from LA. Sam, you're on. What's on your mind?
Well, there's a lot on my mind. Thanks for having me on. It's my first time, by the way.
Welcome to the show, Sam.
On in the morning, so I can actually listen to you when I get up. There's hardly anyone that actually gets up and does this in the morning. So I was in Palestine in 2003. I was an activist with the ISM. I saw a lot of stuff in the 2 months I was there. I think one of the big questions you asked the last guest was, how does Israel perpetuate this cognitive dissonance across the rest of the world, right? How do they keep everyone from realizing what the fuck is actually going on?
Hey, you can't say that.
Hey, you can't say
real
that.
quick. I appreciate you calling in for the first time, but you can't.
So look at Seth
You
Rogen.
can't curse.
Look at what happened with Seth Rogen when he was on Mark Maron recently. Like the Hosmer office called his mom in Vancouver, and she told him he has to retract it. Look at what happened to Mordecai Vanunu in Israel. If you don't know about him, look his story up, man. He outed them for having nukes. They still have not admitted it. They have the largest or fourth largest arsenal in the world. And he was like chased all over Europe, and he's been on detention at home for years ever since. Mordecai Vanunu, man. Look up Najee Ali, a cartoonist from Palestine.
We need to close it now. So I'm gonna have to interrupt. I want to thank you for the call. Thank you for calling in for the first time, Sam. We need to close today's show out. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Have a great weekend. See you again, 7 a.m. Eastern, Monday morning.